I was trying to make some arrangements on the phone recently. But he's just about the most far-out healer I can think of that I've ever bumped into.
That is fascinating.
Try to figure it out, huh?
I think it's interesting that he fills the tooth with amalgam or whatever instead of just healing the tooth.
Yeah, well, it depends on the problem. He does everything, all the way from
root canal,
anything that the person needs.
Yeah.
And he doesn't touch him, he just talks, you know. And it doesn't happen to everybody in the audience. I was at a meeting a few months ago in Florida, and maybe 10% of the audience had major changes. But still, even if one does it, it's still an incredible phenomenon. You know?
Nothing else? I'd heard of him.
Have you ever heard of anything like that anywhere else?
I think Omni had
anywhere else. No, just
no, I haven't either.
Anything else besides teeth? What if you?
Well, he does other healings, but a lot of other healers can do the other kind of healing. But what's absolutely mind-blowing is the metal filling of various kinds appearing in the teeth. So anyway, he's well worth studying, mostly because he's not going to be around too long.
And I was going to add that for those that weren't with us last night, Dr. Puharich said that many of the great healers that he's worked with and studied are gone now.
Gone.
And that there don't seem to be new ones coming up in the ranks.
No good replacements,
which in itself is sort of fascinating. You
wonder
why.
It's a sociological phenomenon that nobody will touch.
But I would think that there would be almost more freedom and more interest these days to be a non-traditional healer because there's so much more interest in them.
Yeah. No, but I'm thinking of it from the professional's point of view. You know, you don't get MDs rushing out and looking at this stuff, right? Maybe half a dozen that I know, that's all. And same way, sociologists, for example, it's been an incredible phenomenon for 18 years that when Geller gets on TV in any country in the world, a whole bunch of kids bend metal. Nobody follows up on it. I just don't understand. The only guy who really did a great job, you know, Hasted in England, he did a really, he collected all these kids and brought them in the lab and really did a systematic job. There's another phenomenon, the avoidance factor.
That's true.
Why don't they want to get entangled in some real research?
When you mentioned that no MDs were investigating it, you reminded me of one critical phone call that I have to make. I'll be right back, please.
Okay, I'll wait.
Go ahead and...
No, I'll wait till you get back.
I'll be very quick.
No, I'll get the thing cranked up. And let's see what we've got in the way. Was to review about 40 years of the kind of investigation I've been doing. And let me explain the motive behind my investigation. I can't say that I was interested in psychic phenomena per se. About 1948, I just finished my medical training, school, internship, residency, and I was pretty much in modeling brain functions. That was my field. And it was also the birth of the age of computers, if you can fancy that so recently. So we were modeling the brain kind of as an input-output electrical circuit, you know, and a lot of people were doing that all the way from Norbert Wiener on down. But one day I met a couple. I was living in California. I was at the Permanente Foundation in Oakland, and this couple told me about a lot of their travels around the world. And they said some weird words like, "Do you know what ESP is?" I said, "No, what is that?" That's how dumb I was, okay? I didn't know. And I said, "What is it?" And they said, "Well, it's, you know, a person can be in one place and somebody can be in another place and messages go." I said, "Come on." I didn't believe it. Anyway, they were very persuasive, and then we got snowed in Maine in a snowstorm, so we were stuck together for a week, and they kept talking and talking, and finally they convinced me of one thing, that if they're right, then I'm all wrong in the line of research I'm going on. So I asked myself two basic questions. Okay, if this thing exists, which I didn't know, must have some electromagnetic basis, because you have to remember in the 40s that's all we knew is electromagnetic communication. A lot of other things had not really been developed. So through a quirk of circumstances, I was supposed to go in the Army in 48, and I didn't because of some medical things. And I said, okay, I got 2 years for free. I'm going to answer that one question because I don't want to spend away my life doing the wrong investigation. So my basic investigation, I don't want to go into all the details, was to answer those two questions. Okay, does ESP exist? And if it does, is it electromagnetic in nature? And I wound up in Maine. Let's see, I need a pointer. Anybody got a pointer? Here, I'll use a pen.
You don't have an official pointer here?
Oh, that's okay, I got one, thanks. So anyway,
Left it at home.
here was the strategy. The strategy was to get somebody who claimed to have ESP and put them in a Faraday cage. Now, if they could communicate with the outside world, we set up all kind of fancy randomized targets, not human targets in this case. And the idea was to build a Faraday cage, put them inside, and if they could get through, then two things would be answered at once. One would be certainly that their so-called ESP existed, but the most important thing was that it was not electromagnetic. So I don't want to go into all the details, but this is...
So you didn't know about ELF then?
No,
You thought
nobody
the
knew.
Faraday cage would block
Nobody
all
knew.
possible
No.
electromagnetic.
Yeah, ELF, well, we knew that neutrinos and cosmic rays, all kinds of things would go through, but they didn't seem to be very suitable communication means. And ELF was, to my knowledge, not known. It wasn't until a paper appeared in Poland somewhere about in the 50s or 60s, I forget, where this guy hypothesized that maybe these extremely long waves, is what they call them, would might be a communication means. So we went at it slowly, clumsily, over the years. Anyway, just to give you a quick idea, you can see we're in the 40s here, huge audio tape recorders, and anyway, the basic idea was that we had, doesn't show it very clearly, but we have an outside screen cage, inside solid sheet metal cage, and inside that another screen cage, which is here. And this is the subject we used, the famous Eileen Garrett, who, the great thing about her was she loved research. She loved to be challenged. She had the old Irish dander, and so she helped enormously. So basically, somebody, this happened to be myself, would sit inside the cage, and there was a system which, part of the long experiment, we had another building 3/10 of a mile away with an equivalent Faraday cage setup, and in the other Faraday cage setup, we had a pure random target which big cosmic ray pulses hit a detector, and she was supposed to tell when, that was her signal, that it hit the detector, and then we had a very precise time base to measure accuracy. But the reason that you're looking at three-walled Faraday cages is that we were testing, once we got past the initial thing that she could do it, we're testing the effect of fields across the cages. We'd just run up to 1,000,000 volts across the cages, inside or outside, and that did improve performance. But the average result from Eileen Garrett or other psychics which we brought in, all of whom were unusual people, were usually probabilities 1,000,000 to 1 against chance occurrence. So that's the way we work the whole thing. Now, the next step in advancing this problem, this is just a quick picture of what the setup looked like. This plate here is the equivalent of the outside cage. This is the solid metal cage, and this is the screen cage. And there are various capacitance arrangements between the fields which are measured and marked. And this particular experiment was run with a 640 cycle oscillator, which is interrupted at 8. See how ancient that is, cycles per second. Nobody uses that anymore. It's, pulses per second, or hertz. And that was purely arbitrary. We had no idea what the hell we were doing. I don't even remember why the engineer did that. But anyway, in this particular setup, the pulse, as you can see, was across here to ground. And Eileen Garrett was supposed, and it was run by a random generator, was supposed to guess when the pulse was on and off again, same type of experiment. And I was convinced that, you know, this stuff was real. Now, William and I were discussing the type of situation we use as a target. This is called the matching abacus test. Now, the reason, it'd be obvious to all of you why we did this, was the subject would have a randomized row of targets here, and over here were the randomized order of numbers. So there's a probability set of 10 factorial, which is 3.6 million combinations between 10 numbers. And it's a very hard test to get better than chance. That's why we designed it, because at this point we already had unusual super performers, and you know the names of a lot of them. But the reason I had to design this was, in working with Peter Hurkos, his big thing was putting his hands on a photograph or anything that had human contact, even a graphite dot on a piece of paper. And so he couldn't touch the photograph. We put 10 different photographs and had him match them up. He was absolutely astounding. He would get 9 out of 10 matches consistently. So that's why we designed the test. And there's one important thing to remember. Anyway, the subject was here blindfolded, and the sender would try to influence his thing, sometimes either falsely or, you know, playing the games of how you can influence the person. But here's a better view of the entire setup. And now, at that time, I just want to say we didn't know a damn thing about the fundamental information system of the world, and I use that very advisedly. But it turns out, after years of investigation, and with the help of a psychic viewer who could look inside the electron, inside the proton, the dynamics of all the 4 fundamental forces, we found out that there were 10 fundamental units of information, which are magnetic monopoles, but I'll go into that in great detail, inside the proton, which is the source of the ELF scalar waves, which we eventually identified as a carrier system. So it turned out to be the same information system, and this was actually worked out by Bell Telephone Lab engineers in the 30s when they had the problem of trying to figure out how many numbers you should have in the ordinary telephone and how many people you could reach with a certain set of numbers. And they found out that out of 10 numbers you could make a combinatorial set of 3.6 million different combinations and permutations. And in those days there wasn't a city in the world that had 3.6 million inhabitants that had telephone. And of course, as time went on, people got phones, you just kept adding extra digits and local areas.
So why they added that new area code in Los Angeles recently?
Yeah, the 818, you mean? Yeah, because it got too big, right? So anyway, the interesting thing is, I went to the University of Wisconsin at that time, which had a numerical calculation lab, and they were able to work out all the statistics for us and the combinations and permutations, so that if you got a certain number of matches, you'd have a certain probability and so on. But it's interesting that by pure happenstance, we picked a combinatorial set that later turned out to be a basic information system of the universe, which is what I'm getting to basically. Now, there are a lot of things that happen in the research, but I want to just give you kind of bottom line, it's a crude schematic. Here's how we got up to this. First place, we found out, this is in the family, but most of you probably don't know that in 1948 the CIA and the U.S. Navy started their first psychic warfare operations, and it happened to be the time when I started this work, and I was in Maine in a tiny little community. I had a neighbor who was internationally known concert violinist. His name was Hurkos, and he had a friend. His name is Rexford Daniel. They're old buddies. And Daniel used to come up to Maine, and in the summertime he heard about our work. So he dropped over to see what we were doing, and make a long story short, I found out that he was the first chief of the...
Hi, Dennis.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Andrija.
Dennis Stacy.
Dennis
I had
Stacy.
met you once before in Dallas.
Oh, good.
Talked to the UFO group up there.
Oh, yeah,
Chair
sure.
over there, Dennis. You can pull around back here.
So anyway, to make a very long story short, it turned out that Rexford Daniel was the first chief of the Navy ESP warfare project, which was then called Project Penguin. And so they didn't know what the hell was going on either, but they decided they better get into this work. And so he asked me if I would be kind enough to let them attach an observer to my staff. I said, fine. So they assigned a Navy lieutenant, Bob Baker, who was an engineer by training, and he just tried to see what was going on to get some orientation into this field. And later on, the intelligence community would flood our lab. Each one wanted to have their own personal demonstration of their own personal problem. And there were lots of problems. So we did this just off the cuff. It wasn't a formal relationship. But Bob Baker was the one who, being a very good engineer, was interested in whether, besides playing with electric fields, which were the DC charges, and the electromagnetic targets, both of which were allowed the passage of ELF signals, whatever that means at that time. And he was the one who rigged up an experiment to put magnetic pulses. They were very crude pulses. If you want to know how crude it was, took a 12-volt battery and did a dead short with a knife switch, and that was the target, okay? But anyway, it was a very powerful signal to the psychic. And you could see it in their EEG, which we always monitored a lot of the activities. And that was when we began to get the idea that maybe there was a carrier for this kind of information. And the earliest setup that we used, and it's still the setup we use now, but it keeps getting refined. This is the ELF scalar detector, and what you have is a soft iron core here and thousands of turns of fine wire, and this is locked up in a steel shield, and it's grounded, and over here the shielding is complete all the way to the other end. And anyway, here we have an up amplifier, and here we have a oscilloscope. Everything is battery operated, and here we have a frequency counter. And we still use the thing, but as the years go by, equipment improves and the sensitivity improves, the gain improves, and so on. So this is the basic thing we'll be doing here with Southwest people if they, go along with the whole idea.
Who came up with that design for the scalar detector? Was that your design?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, it's kind of an obvious. We tried a lot of other things, but this is the one that finally worked. We spent quite a few years just using the EEG as a signal detector, but it's not very good because it picks up electromagnetic signals from the brain. And David Cohn, probably familiar with his work, was the first one who probed very deeply what the magnetic output of the brain was, and he built a special mu metal shielded room at MIT, which you probably remember back in the 50s. And he showed conclusively that the magnetic wave coming out of the brain was exactly the same as the electromagnetic wave, except it was phase shifted, usually about 90 degrees rotation, which would fit the Maxwellian concept of the relationship between the electric vector and the magnetic vector. Anyway, another part of this study, am I in your way here? This is just, I guess this will show up all right. In probing this problem, the problem still was always, now we accepted ESP, was what is the carrier and what is the information system, the modulation. And so a parallel field of work developed by Isidore Rabi in the early 40s, for which he got the Nobel Prize, was what is now called MRI, magnetic resonant imaging, but then it was called nuclear magnetic resonance, NMR. And I want to show you some, let's see, it's a little hard to get a sharp image. This is from a textbook, but with the best they can. I think it's legible, okay? It turns out that, just for those who don't know, nuclear magnetic resonance means that at the core of every atom, like a hydrogen atom, carbon, nitrogen, and so on, there are spinning fundamental particles, protons and neutrons. And these are little magnetic tops. One end is North Pole, the other is South Pole. And the original findings were that if you put a electromagnetic field that was in resonance with the precession frequency of the little dipole, that if you then put another signal at right angles in, you would flip it, and in that flip you would read its true resonant frequency. Now when you look at NMR data, it's very confusing because they're always measuring several things. They're measuring the frequency of the field across the dipole, which holds it in a certain position. They measure the right angle frequency, which flips it over, and then the real measurement is the frequency of the flip, and that's what we're looking at here. And when you look at NMR data, it's very confusing unless you're an expert, because they also have something called chemical shift, which is another phenomenon related to the two high-frequency signals. So anyway, I began to get curious. For example, when you look at this particular compound, there's a double bond between the two carbons, and the coupling range that is between this hydrogen and this one is 7 to 9 hertz. And in this particular case, when you have a carbon and a sulfur, and these of course are at right angles there, the coupling frequency is 6 to 8 hertz. And so it goes down through quite a range of frequencies, 8 to 16, 5 to 10, and so on, which tells you there's a specific signature for various couplings. Now the couplings are always, this chart doesn't show it, but they're between the proton and the proton. It's like they have a magnetic coupling, very much like North-South pole magnets will attract, and light poles will repel, and it has a specific frequency. So that started a long search on the role of the proton in this signal we were looking at that I showed you in the chart. Now, there's some other points I want to bring out before I go on to the next point. I think one of our major breakthroughs occurred in an experiment we did in 1960. The experiment is very simple. I was with Aldous Huxley in Tecate, Mexico at a conference, and we're sitting around in the shade of the tree after a hot day in a desert, and it just came out in conversation that Laura Huxley, his wife, was a healer, which I didn't know. So I said, well, how do you do your healing? She puts her hands on and so on, and that's all she does. And I said, can you give me some cases? So she had a friend who was at the conference. His name was Maris Lindsay. And to make a long story very condensed, she had a very severe cardiac problem called ventricular arrhythmia, which is potentially capable of, in one heartbeat, knocking you out permanently. Your heart goes into fibrillation. So she'd been on medication, which in those days was quinidine sulfate, and she got to Laura, and Laura inquired about her condition and so on, and said, you know, I'd like to help you. So she did her healing, hands across the chest and so on. And after a few days, Maris began to feel better. So they continued this for a while, and finally they felt something was happening. And they went to Maris's cardiologist, who happened to be a very open-minded guy, and they told him about their little Sorcerer's Apprentice experiment. And he wasn't shocked. He said, well, let's follow it for a couple of weeks, and he checked the EKG and found out that the rhythm was very even. And after a couple of weeks of steady improvement, which means normal rhythm instead of extra ventricular beats, he said, okay, I'll take you off the quinidine sulfate and we'll see what happens. And from that time to the time that I met the two ladies, it was about 3 years, and she'd been off of quinidine sulfate and went periodically to have a healing. Another good type of experiment for us, but highly dangerous. I wouldn't want to fool with it, obviously, because it's life-threatening. And so I said, okay, you know, simple-minded thinking. Here's an electrical phenomenon, heart. Maybe there's something electrical. Maybe there isn't, because we didn't know. Still, we were groping around with all these different possibilities. And I talked to Barbara Brown, who's a neurophysiologist at UCLA, and said, could we use your laboratory to measure the interaction between these two ladies? And the best thing we had was EEGs. So since she had a very complete laboratory, we went ahead with it, and we laid the patient down on the table, covered her with a white sheet so she couldn't tell where the hands were of the healer. And we wired them up with a lot of other readouts, DC skin potential changes, and electrocardiogram, and so on. And the most astounding thing, well, I guess I'll have to kind of do it in the air. I guess I can't. Anyway, what we found essentially, just imagine I have
Would you like, I can bring you my flip chart.
Yeah, I got a flip chart that will help a lot, save a lot of time. What happened was that when Laura's hand got within about 4 inches of the skin of the back, and her hand was going up the back from the thoracic spine up to the cervical spine, her EEG went into, I've never seen such a phenomenon in all my years of looking at EEG, went into a very high amplitude alpha wave, which happened to be 8 hertz. Oh, thank you. And moments later, see that? Oh, that's very nice. You got a little chalk gadget?
How about a green marker?
Yeah, that'll show you. Okay, let's say this is Laura's EEG and this is Maris. They're on separate strip charts in the beginning, and when Laura reaches 4-inch area, her EEG went like this. It was such an extreme, oh, thank you. It was such an extreme swing, I've never seen it that high, that the amplifiers actually flipped off the signal. We had to readjust everything to show the full extent. And moments later, milliseconds later, the EEG of Maris, the patient, would be entrained so that it looked like that. And the two signals would phase lock. And that phenomenon is called entrainment, and this one was driving this one. So that was the first real breakthrough we had as what might be going on. And the specific information was that it was in the alpha range, in this case in healing it was 8 hertz, and the instrument wasn't precise enough so we could measure better than whole numbers. We didn't know what the fraction was. Later on we found out it had to be accurate to 3 decimal points to get a certain effect.
About how long did that last?
As long as the hand was there. And then it would damp out. It was driven directly by the presence of the healer. So now we had a bunch of data on our hand. Let me give you some more bits of data to give you the picture we're developing. And I mentioned this to you earlier. But,
I was going to ask you, what kind of subjective reports did Laura have? Does she feel anything different when she was close to the patient?
Yeah, subjectively, every healer kind of resonates at a certain point, whatever that means, but kind of a sympathetic vibration occurs between them and the patient, and it's very vague. It's not a tingling, it's not heat, although that's part of the phenomena, but if I had to describe it, it would be almost as though the muscles of the body went into resonance with at this 8 hertz. Incidentally, 8 hertz kind of a resonant center frequency for muscle vibration. You can see it particularly in the eye muscles. If you go out in the sunlight on a bright day like today and you close your eyes and your muscles are kind of twitching, you'll see they're about 8 hertz. So that's what I understand, but it's very hard for them to describe what's going on. But they know they've hit it, you know. It's like somebody going out duck shooting and they're sweeping their rifle. You know, when they get the line of sight on the thing and pull the trigger, they know it's it, but they can't describe the process much better than that. And they're only right or wrong if the duck is hit and falls into the water. But good healers seem to sense that. Okay, now, we had a number of things going on. We were zeroing in on this 8 hertz phenomena, which we had done sporadically on the EEG and that matching abacus test. When the person would hit the right target, we'd see little blips, particularly in their right temporal cortex, at about 8 hertz. But again, the measurements were not precise because the EEGs aren't that precise. Now they have very precise analytic frequencies and Fourier transforms and so on, but then we couldn't measure it precisely. But one other experiment which is very important, as part of the work with Eileen Garrett, as I mentioned earlier, we wanted a purely randomized target, and the best one we could find at that time was cosmic rays, because when a cosmic ray hits the Earth, the incidence of the next one is totally independent of the first one or the succeeding one. And I might add that a fellow named Richard Wilson, who was a graduate student at Cornell at the time, a Britisher, helped us design that experiment because he was a high-energy particle physicist. And he happened to survive that kind of association with us. He's now chairman of the Department of Physics at Harvard.
Is that the same Wilson cloud chamber phase?
No, it's another one, yeah.
Is it the background radiation Wilson or
No,
Wilson Penzias?
he's just best known for high particle accelerator type of work, you know, high energy particles. But he's neither one of those two. Anyway, Dick was a great help in all this problem. In fact, is he actually designed and built the cosmic ray detector, and design was very important because, as I say, cosmic rays are pretty random. And if you're running an experiment like we're running, you don't want to wait 2 days for the next cosmic ray pulse to get there, everybody would fall asleep. So the experiment was designed as a coincidence counter. You had 2 counter tubes, and by rotating them at certain angles, you could almost guarantee it. You get at least 1 pulse in 30 minutes, so you get something to shoot at in one experiment. But anyway, that didn't create any artifact. But the important point of that experiment was that If I can
Sure.
chart this out. As I said earlier, Eileen Garrett was the subject. She was in one Faraday cage, and 3/10 of a mile away was the other Faraday cage, and sealed from all local disturbances, which is very important. If you had some local disturbance that would trigger the strip chart recorder, that would break the random nature of it. So it was all shielded in the cage, and essentially you're looking at a strip chart like this, and it would show an event like this. That's the cosmic ray pulse going through the detectors. And over here, she was in the cage talking, but we recorded what she was saying on audio tape, and she had to say now, or it is here now, as her call that she saw the target hitting this device. So we had a coincidence base in time. So this thing happened at, let's say, 3 minutes and 41 seconds, minutes of the experiment. 3 minutes, 41 seconds of the experiment. We could cross-correlate because they're on the same time base. So anyway, the amazing thing was, well, she had no problem calling out exactly when the cosmic ray pulse hit the strip chart. That was no problem. But I used to sit with her and watch how she reacted and so on. And she would start talking about the cosmic ray pulse. And I thought it was just idle chatter, that it was coming. And I said, well, what does it look like? And she described a mercurial type of globule that was spinning and moving at high speed. And eventually I asked her to go out there and find the cosmic ray pulse out in space. And they're traveling at 186,000 miles a second. Lock onto it, ride it in, and tell us when it was going to hit and then when it actually hit. In other words, so she was able to do that to an astonishing level, and it's a classic experiment in terms of tight control and fabulous results. But that told us another thing of this whole puzzle. Let's see if we can look at it in another way. Let's say that we have here an axis. And this is time, and this is now, and this is the future, right? And this is the past, okay? Now, according to conventional physics, you can set up an equation, and there's no problem showing an axis like this, and you say this is forward time, this is reverse time. And, but nobody's ever been able to find the nature of reverse time or even measure. In fact, as I would say, it's one of the most baffling experiments in physics, even though the theory is well known, and it's just an axis like this. And it's called time reversal, but in the literature now you'll find they have a real fancy word for it. It's called phase conjugation. And of course, conjug is coupling, and phase is a certain phase, so they have a phase between these forward and reverse time that goes back and forth like a slide rule, a slide going back and forth, and that's why they call it phase conjugation. The time reversal is easier to understand. Well, these experiments with Eileen Garrett really gave us a problem, because first Einstein, and I respect Einstein enormously, said nothing can move faster than the speed of light, right? That's axiomatic in the special theory of relativity, and every scientist believes that these days. And if you say that maybe there's another possibility, they go ape on you. I mean, there's no question about it. I've done this many times. And a guy named Gary Feinberg, a friend of mine at Columbia University, came along about almost 25 years ago with a theory showing that time could go faster than the speed of light, and he's a very well respected scientist. And what he said was very simple. It convinced me that he was on the right track. The Einstein equation, special relativity, let's say we're looking at time here, and that's equal to square root of 1 minus v squared over c squared. I'm sorry, it's the other way around. 1 being here, which is the speed of light. And Feinberg pointed out very clearly that since this velocity, this is the velocity of light squared, and this is the velocity you're measuring, and that forms a certain ratio. And so it's always got to be less than 1. That's the essence of this equation. But Feinberg pointed out very clearly and simply that there are 2 solutions to every equation, and that Einstein chose to ignore the other one, which is the square root of 1 plus v squared over c squared. And what this tells you is that light, assuming 1 represents the velocity of light, that the velocity of light in this solution always has to be greater than the speed of light, and it has certain curves and so on. And that's been played a lot with, particularly by our friends Hal Puthoff and Russ Targ and that school of thought. So this is what we were up against, and to put it very simply, for somebody to go out in space, or the farthest out she could go, 120 seconds from the time the target arrived on Earth, right? To do that, you have problems. The person is sitting here, somewhere out in space is a cosmic ray on a vector headed toward Earth, and there are thousands of them hitting the Earth all the time, and she's somehow got to go out here, pick this one up when it's 120 times 186,000, which is a lot of distance away, and then ride it back slowly at less than the speed of light. Now immediately you have a paradox. It means either she has to go out here faster than the speed of light, and I mean really faster, like 120 times the speed of light, and come back slowly, or there must be some mechanism where you can reverse time, which means time reversal, and go forward in time at some hypervelocity again, obviously, and then come back at a very slow trolley. So that was the problem we faced when we got the results of this experiment. But it wasn't satisfactory to me because it was tangled up in a lot of math and a lot of deductions, and it wasn't very satisfactory. So I devised the simplest experiment I could think of when I got to work with Geller in '71, which was, I think, to my mind, the best experiment ever done in time reversal, where I'd put a kidney bean in his hand and close his hand over it, and I'd say, make it grow. And hit the little sprout would come out, leaves and all, in about 2 minutes, usually about 3 inches long. So we did that a lot of times. Finally, I got him to do the next phase of the experiment, which was to make it sprout, and I'd say make it grow back into the bean, and the thing would disappear, and there would be the bean, a little cracked, and I would plant the bean to make sure there wasn't genetic damage, which there wasn't. It would grow normally. And so that's, we called it growth and forward time, just GIFT for short, and growth and backward time, the opposite. And the key to that experiment was that the bean and all its biological complexity, the DNA and its nucleus and so on, was the clock. And to me, one of the best methods of measure, well, no matter what you measure, you use a clock. I don't care whether it's an electronic clock or a mechanical clock. And you know, Einstein belabored us to death with all the mechanical clocks. They went at a certain speed, they would shrink, time would go slower, and all that stuff, you know. Those are mechanical clocks. But the point is, all clocks have some mechanistic aspect, even if it's a cesium clock or one of the, you know, that puts out pulses. So anyway, I was convinced that time reversal was real. And so I began to do a lot of experiments on the phenomenon of time reversal, which I won't go into because basically the experiments that we eventually wound up doing started with Peter Hurkos and then later on with Geller, was that Peter Hurkos could be pushed into the future and predict events. I'll give you one typical example. Peter was working in one of those Faraday cage setups one day, and we had not started out to do a real precognition experiment, but he suddenly blurted out, and everything was tape recorded in time, that within 24 hours there would appear, and in his bad English, Dutch, he said there would be an Erdball. That means an earth ball. And what the hell is an earth ball? I didn't know what it meant. He said, well, it's a thing that is launched and it looks around, comes from the ground. This was October 1957. And we had a colonel from the Pentagon observing this experiment. And anyway, Peter said it had been launched from Earth and it was launched by the Russians. Well, we didn't know what the hell he was talking about because there was no such thing then. But the next day there was Sputnik. Okay? So that's the kind of stuff we did, and we were convinced that he could. Now you could, argue academically and say, well, they had the thing built there on the ground and they knew when they were going to launch it, and he socked in there. But we have all kind of evidence that he didn't rely on somebody else's prior information, which usually turned out to be confusing. For example, in cases of medical history, he would see somebody from the military, and, excuse me, can I have a little glass of water? Sure. I seem to be getting dry. Thank you.
Would you rather have coffee or just plain water?
Just water, thank you. Anyway, in case of medical diagnosis, which is again another biological clock, he would look at some individual and say, in 2 weeks, if you don't do something, you're going to get an ulcer or you're going to get a heart attack. And of course, that would give anybody a heart attack to be told that, right? And but anyway, we followed a lot of those cases, and they would go to their doctor, and the doctor would check them out and do all sorts of preventive things, but nevertheless they would get the heart attack or the ulcer, but it was mitigated by prior care, you see. So we had a lot of evidence that he could follow processes that were independent pretty much of human articulation of those things. And this holds for areas, you might just as well know that he was so astounding. In 1963, I took him to the CIA and convinced them by their own tests, which were geopolitical or military, that the guy could see in the future, could reconstruct information from the past. We did one experiment which he was given a rock from Pompeii, which happened in 79 AD. And he clearly described, like looking at a movie, what happened when that rock blew up and the city burned up and all that stuff. So he could, you can't measure too far in advance, as you all know. Oh, thank you.
There you go. Sure, I hate
in psychic work in advance, because you'd sit around forever for a 5-year prediction, right, or a 20-year prediction. So you have to set up little Mickey Mouse experiments like we did, where the precognition is within a couple of minutes. But that's the important thing, is that with the cosmic ray experiments and with the beam experiments, incidentally, Geller does this publicly now. He passes out various kinds of beans, whichever happen to suit him at the moment or what's available in the local market, in the audience, and he holds one and tells them to concentrate on it, and his will always sprout, and half the audience will usually, I don't know that some of you may have seen this, will have a bean or seed sprout in their hands.
I have 2 questions.
Yeah, oh, please interrupt me.
Okay, I didn't want to interrupt you, but
yeah, I'm
getting so far ahead, I don't want to.
Yeah, I want to make sure we understand each other, right.
The earlier experiment where, I think it was Eileen Garrett, you said, was guessing
electric,
the timing of the cosmic ray hitting it. You said it would be an exact hit. What was your criterion for calling it hit? In other words, it was a minute off, 10 seconds off?
Yeah, in the statistics, because of human reaction time, you know how people say, well, we gave them 10 seconds before or after. That's the criteria for a hit.
And what was the average
Inter-ray interval.
yeah, your average inter-ray and standard deviations.
I have to have the statistics
Do
with
you have
me.
any feel for, I mean, did one come about every half an hour, or did one come every 30 seconds?
30 minutes.
The average incidence of, and then I'm doing this from memory. Remember, this was a long time ago. I didn't bring the statistics with me. The average incidence was about 3.2 minutes of a cosmic ray averaged over hundreds and hundreds of trials. As I say, we could adjust the angle of the coincident counters to get either less targets hitting the detector or more. And sometimes we're kind of impatient, you know, want to see more results. And once in a while there are cosmic ray bursts that, you know, they come in a big hurry. But that was essentially the parameter of the standard deviation and the time factor involved with the calls.
Okay, the other question I had was the one you just said. I'm not sure. Is this the same subject? Yeah, this must have been the same one where you said she would then call ahead a couple minutes, and you were speculating about going out and following the thing in.
Yeah.
It seems to me a more parsimonious explanation, which wouldn't involve all this theorizing about thinking and faster than going out faster than light, is that people just seem to be able to precognize events that they get feedback to in the future. So in other words, what she's doing is going ahead to her own experience 2 minutes. It has nothing to do with going out there and finding the cosmic ray. Once the event is in her future, then it's a matter of like extrapolating by triangulation and inference that, oh, there it is and it's coming in.
Well, that was my immediate reaction to the first time and she did this for many months, I might add. You know, the precognition is a precognition. You don't have to run out to the future and run back. Okay, it's a simultaneous field. But what got me was that in analyzing her data, that she would start as early as 120 seconds saying, oh, I see it, and she started describing it and going in with it. In other words, she was actually in the velocity of arrival at Earth. And what puzzled me is how the hell she got out there so fast. Now, I know it's a mechanistic approach, but I don't think we know of any other approach. When you're dealing with a target that is a velocity, that's fundamental, right? And it's got to start somewhere in space. We know that because satellites can go out and pick them up and so on. They're a big hazard in space travel. I had to assume, I had no other assumption, that she got out there and she was following the bloody thing back. In order to get out there that fast, she had to, you know, get out there at a very high velocity. So I had no other explanation.
But again, if there are billions of cosmic rays in every direction in space, to track the one that's going to eventually hit the detector,
mission impossible.
Well, well, that's right. Mission impossible. It seems to me it's more parsimonious to just assume.
To take count of that, you have to remember.
But you can. It seems more parsimonious to just assume that granted the knowledge that an event's going to happen, then everything else is unprovable.
No.
Though she subjectively felt like she was following it in.
If you're talking about an event in the future, that involves time. You can't get away from that. How do you get to the forward time and how do you bring the information back? See, you haven't addressed the real question. And nobody does because it's too hairy. But I'll give you some answers to that. I mean, there's a number of possible answers which physicists have thought of. Answer number one is that there may be infinite velocities. In other words, they junk the Einstein paradigm and say there may be infinite velocities in the universe. And there's good physics to support that idea. In other words, you go up a curve and you hit the velocity of light. And then there's that famous equation in all of physics, c squared. So you have velocity squared. And then another equation will have velocity cubed. You enter into different velocity domains. And I think that's a more, you know, within the ignorance we have in modern physics, and it's all a big open ball game. There's nothing set. You know, every year somebody flips over the paradigms. I think the idea of sequential accelerations of velocity is more pertinent, and somewhere in that time slot, for example, let's go at it a little differently. Let's say there is a real signal. Now I'll get to what the signal is later. There's a real signal. Can the human mind, and think of it very carefully, deal with a velocity that's faster than the speed of light? And just think about it a little more. For example, look at every velocity we deal with. Vision. That's coming into us at the velocity of light. What happens after the light wave hits the retina and it gets converted to a very slow speed? The little pulses you can read off, millisecond pulses, so that's not very fast. And then it goes to the first synapse, and there's a conversion from the electrical pulse to the chemical, and the whole thing, we move very, very slowly. We're like turtles. The same thing happens with the eye, same thing happens with touch. Every sense you can think of is almost subsonic in its velocity. So how in the hell can we pick up a signal first? Well, we can pick up the light velocity. Okay, we'll grant that. But how can you pick up something that's faster than the speed of light? It'll go right through the target and never see it, so to speak. You know what I mean? Like an infinitely fast bullet would go through matter without distorting anything because it's moving to the molecular atomic structure. We're addressing one of the worst problems in modern physics. I mean, time is something nobody can... For example, in interview a 99 out of 100 physicists, and they will tell you something like, time is just a metric. It's like a yardstick. It's an inch, and it has no real meaning except relative to some arbitrary thing in Paris and so on. And there's no substance of time. It does not have an energetic basis, right? And maybe 1 out of 100 physicists like David Bohm or some of the other far-out thinkers will say, yes, it has a quality. And Tom Bearden is one of the most vociferous people, saying that every bit of time, and it's a purely metaphoric phrase, has a bit of energy attached to it. Well, nobody can find that energy that I know of. Even neutrinos have a hell of a time catching their passage in their sub-light velocity. So it's a real hairy problem.
Doesn't Charles Nuzis write about that too?
Yeah, Charles is great in that area, and I've worked with him for some 30 years. But again, in his scheme, it's an orthorotation, and Arthur Young says the same thing. It's an orthorotation, 90-degree rotation, and you get into the next level of light velocity. There's still velocity, right? But not the real... I don't know of anybody, in the world, and I keep up with most of the good physicists, who can give you something substantive to show that light is like a bunch of little sausages strung out in a row, and each one is a packet of energy. I mean, photons are supposed to have a packet of energy according to H, Nu's theory, but it's the mass that has the energy, the action, the H. And so on. And there's no bottom to this argument. I've been to a lot of conferences all over the world in which this argument is brought up. I don't know of anybody who's got an answer. I'd like to have an answer, because to me it's very important. Like, what runs the clock, the biological clock? Everybody talks about the biological clock, and some stick it here and some stick it there and so on. How does it precisely meter out the sequence of evolution of DNA in terms of billions of cells at one time? Why don't they, one chunk of DNA goes off in this direction, instead of having an arm, you have a snake, and one goes off in this direction, you have an alligator. Time must have some controlling quality. And the only place I see that is in it's called metal bending, because there we have pretty clear evidence that at 7 hertz it bends metal, and that 7 hertz resonates with the Fermi outer electron ring which gives all material its structural rigidity. You know, that's a well-known concept. But anyway, I wish I could answer the question, but I ain't got no answer. I know the problem, that's all I know.
What do you think of, is it Kozyrov's work where he claims to be able to measure physical properties of time?
Are you talking about
Russian
Kolmogorov?
I think it's Kozyrov, the Russian astrophysicist.
Oh, I know, I'm sorry, yeah. Yeah, he's one of the people who's got a hypothesis, and I've corresponded with him, Kozyrov, for a long time. And what was his proof? I've forgotten at the moment. It's something...
He's measuring positions of stars or something like that.
I forget what it was.
Behaves differently at different times.
Yeah, it's a good approach, but there's no final solution.
Like
while you're talking about that, I don't know if you're aware of it. I read about 40 scientific journals a week. That's why my head is full of garbage. There have been a number of experiments reported in the last year in which one telescope looks out into space and it sees a binary star system, and this one explodes. And then they have another telescope looking at the other part of the binary, and they measure the velocity of transmission of light or radio waves, depending on what they're looking at. And they find out that this signal goes out at less than the velocity of light, and this one goes out as fast as 10 times the velocity of light. And most of those articles are in Nature. So that's the first measurement I know of, which does it, artificially by triangulation, that there is a velocity faster than the speed of light. And physicists aren't talking about that because that's one of their idols, is the constancy of the velocity of light. That doesn't answer our question at all, but it just says, if you follow all the scientific arguments from A to Z, and the triangulation is valid since Pythagoras, you have to re-examine everything when some of these new ideas come up.
Are they accepting that the measurements are valid?
The measurement.
Well, then what are the 99 out of 100 physicists that don't believe that?
Well, they haven't read it, How many physicists read 40 magazines a week, It's hard to keep up with physics. Have you ever tried? I mean, madness, There's stuff coming out of the ears of everybody. But the fundamentals are still, fundamentals in all of science, let's face it, we're all scientists, it's very shaky. Somebody said it, it gets accepted, and it's like a pontifical statement, then it goes on, till some wise guy comes along and pulls the rug out from under the idol. That's science, right? I mean, we all love it. We love to see old idols crash to the ground. Okay, now I want to get on with this discussion. I had enough data at this point, and when I say this point, I'm saying 1972. These experiments are running from 48 to 72. And we were tampering with some of the fundamental sacred cows of physics all along, which parapsychology always does, right? When they have a good clean-cut experiment. Nobody can explain it physically. And I didn't know what the hell was going on. And I must say that in the 3 years of experiments we did with Uri Geller in 22 different universities, there's ample proof from many laboratories that Geller could dematerialize an object in front of you and make it disappear. And that he could teleport an object and could be recorded, and it could materialize somewhere else. Now that's pushing the mind of parapsychology and physics and everybody else. And those experiments, incidentally, were done at London University and at SRI. The stuff at SRI was all classified, and unless you know Hal Puthoff or Russ Targ or Ed Mitchell or somebody who was there, you won't know about it. But that was rather spooky to the establishment, shall we say. So, having this much information, I knew that I lacked the fundamental, which is theory. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, Russell and Hal publicly will say that there was no documented PK.
That's a party line.
That's the party line.
But that's bullshit.
Right. They say the ESP is,
Oh, ESP
documented
is
so-
okay, yeah.
But they never really observed under tight conditions physical effects.
Do you know any of the experiments that were done?
I've
Did they ever
I've
te-
heard about all
did they
sorts
ever
of
tell you?
experiments.
Did you ever see an experiment where you had control, where the experimenters had control over whatever the object was in a way that Uri couldn't handle it, and then you witnessed it?
I'll give you one example that'll answer all your questions. The experiment was to see if Geller could dematerialize an object, materialize it, and teleport it, okay, all in one set. So we decided that the simplest test would be to take our noble astronaut, Ed Mitchell, without his suit, and give him a sealed briefcase, and there was a clock in there. Nobody saw it except the guy who put it in, which was Hal and Ed Mitchell. And the briefcase was a locked attaché case, and Ed sat with it under his legs here, like nobody could get at it. There was a little room like this, and there was a platform here, and Geller was supposed to dematerialize the clock. It was a stopwatch, we found out later. From inside that case, without any change, and make it fall on the target here. There's a dirty experiment, right, for the poor guy having to do it. And there was one Aeroflex camera over there, 16 millimeter. There was one over there, and then there was an overhead video camera. And we sat around, and Geller kind of puffed and huffed. He was observed on both sides. The camera observed him. Everything was observed by the camera, okay? And at one point, all of us saw this thing come out of the ceiling and go crash, but it made a soft landing. I might add the table was glass. No damage to the glass. Later analysis of the experiment shows that all the data, everybody in the room was continually being monitored by the 3 cameras. But the moment that the watch came down, okay, camera A, 16 millimeter Aeroflex, was disabled. It never recorded the event. Camera B, Aeroflex, was disabled. It never recorded the event. The only thing that recorded the event was the overhead electronic camera. And what you saw afterwards, and we all saw the film, was that into the field would come like flashes on of a film where every third frame was missing. And so you'd see the thing chatter in here, and then a gap, and a chatter in here, chatter in, and finally when it got here, there was the clear picture of the thing. Now, why did the 2 cameras...
When you said they both failed, what kind of failures were they?
Well, that's what I was just going to get to.
How did they fail, and did they both have the same failure?
Yeah, okay. Now that was a puzzle, especially they had a professional cameraman who knew his business, right? He said, oh, damn, I never saw a camera doing that, blah, blah, but they're mechanical cameras, they're not electronic, right? So the guy takes the cameras back to the dark room to take them apart and see what the hell happened. When he took them apart, swear, both drive sprockets had disappeared from inside the camera, but the film recorded the event up to the time this thing started appearing in the other camera. The drive sprockets were found in a 16 millimeter film can inside the dark room lab. So you had in that one experiment, and there was no break, no damage, the lock was intact, the stuff strained right through the clock, strained through the bag, you know, the attaché bag, and it did somehow disappear somewhere, and then it came this way. In other words, it was under the floor here. Now this is a standard classical experiment they did in many different variations, and the reason they classified, and I say they was the CIA, was that Geller scared the shit out of them, pardon me for the language, because when he would do one of these things, whether it's an anti-gravity experiment, whether teleportation, whatever it was, I didn't know it at the time when it was going on. There was a computer lab upstairs at SRI as part of the ARPA network. It was just being developed and very, you know.
George Lawrence, wasn't it?
Yeah, crude stuff. Every time that Geller would do something major, computers would be down, the power line would blow up, something would go. It was different in every case. and a flood of colonels came from Washington, and they got panicky when somebody correlated, I don't know who it was at the moment, that event from Uri would cause the breakdown then, because both ends were clocked, you see. And we had open discussions about it. They said, Jesus Christ, the language is pretty foul, you know. They said, this guy could walk past one of our defense installation where everything is on tape. You know, somebody pressed a button in Washington and all these tapes are activated and the missiles are armed and, you know, the whole thing. And Secret Service came to me specially. I'll never forget the session. You know, nice guys with their Kmart suits and all that stuff, looking like little wooden soldiers. They said, you know, what we're really panicky about is that Geller might trigger the hotline between Washington and Moscow, and that might trigger World War III. And they said, do you think he'd do it? I said, I don't think he gives a shit. If you just pay him, he'll do anything you ask him to do. Maybe somebody will pay him enough to do that. I said, it's too late, because by then we had taken Geller to England and Norway and Sweden and Denmark and Finland, all the, you know, Baltic countries. And every time he went on TV, thousands of people, mostly kids, would report in that they bent metal, the andirons had bent, locks with a smash, and all kind of weird psychokinetic effect. And I said, there are probably thousands of kids that are living right over the hotline, which was underground at that time. And I said, one of them could be on a potty in Gruntard, and he could do it, because he's got obviously the same capability. So I think that that convinced them that it wouldn't be wise to murder Geller. I mean, they were really serious about murdering Geller and getting rid of him, because they thought there was only one guy on the planet, and, you know, if that's the cause of disease, let's get rid of him. You know, it's a military operation. When they found out there are probably millions of people around the planet who could do the same thing, then they chose the policy of hiring Ray Hyman and Brandy and that whole bunch to make a joke out of Geller. But it's effective. It's good propaganda. It worked.
But did these mini Gellers, they obviously did not have quite the same power.
No, a lot of them are formidable.
Are they?
Formidable. A lot of them work for the governments of the countries they're in. Every country's got major psychic warfare operations. Absolutely. Guaranteed. And I think we have one of the best, frankly. Israelis probably are second best. They don't have the resources to pour into it that the U.S. does. And I don't think Russia's as high as all the propaganda leads you to believe, because I spent a lot of time not in Russia. I've been in Russia, but I've talked to a lot of the psychotronic people in all the satellite countries, and I can tell their minds are way low on the totem pole in terms of its potential. Yeah.
I saw the tape of you and Marcello on the Geraldo program. And
Oh, you saw that?
Yeah, I have a copy of it. He asked you an interesting question, which is, if there's this big program going on, how come we, who are supposed to be the professionals in this field, A, don't know about it, and B, if it's true that there are these other people, professionals, that are doing the important work, then that makes us really not the professionals in the field. These other guys whose work is classified are obviously doing the cutting-edge work.
Very good.
Why don't we know about them?
Well, how much time do you spend in Washington? How much time do you spend with the military here locally? You know, Brook, all these places. You've got to get into the inner sanctum. For example, the Army has a very open program on this stuff, and you probably heard about that part. They started out with working with Geller and were convinced that metal bending under their conditions was correct. You know, true. Now, the Army happens to be pretty huffy about the CIA. They don't like the CIA. They don't deal with the CIA unless it's necessary. The Marines will, the Navy does, the Air Force does. So the Army set up its own program, but they had a different goal than most people. They wanted to apply these abilities in combat, okay, not in intelligence. Big difference, right? And if it's in combat, that means they'd have to train soldiers and would leak back to the hometown, etc., etc. So I don't know whether you're aware of this, but I know all the personnel involved. The chief of intelligence at the time this happened, about 8 years ago, was a lieutenant general, and I can't remember his name at the moment, but he's the brother of Lee Marvin, and he looks like Lee Marvin, but Lee Marvin is a stage name, and he has the old German name. Anyway, he set this thing up, and I worked closely with his ADC, Colonel John. And what they did was the following. First, they had to get approval within the Pentagon. And they liked the idea of firewalking. Because why? They have a lot of deaths in tanks and gun control towers and all kind of places where people die because they get panicky when there's a fire. So they took a bunch of GIs and, got these guys who are professionals. This was public knowledge, nothing secret about this, and got them to learn how to walk on coal. You've probably done it yourself with one of these things that people do. And then, you won't believe this, but that's a true story, they got about 30 top generals in the Army. They didn't fool with the Marines or the other agencies. And they taught them how to walk on hot coals. Now, can you see these bunch of tubby little guys going over the hot coals? But they did it, and they got consensus within the Army that this is a good thing to do. They also sponsored all the metal bending parties. Jack Hawk, he does it on behalf of the, and Eldenberg and so on.
You're not talking, when you said Colonel John, that's not Alexander.
Yeah, it's John Alexander. I didn't want to,
Oh, everybody.
Well, he's written on the topic.
Huh?
I mean, he's already published on the topic.
Yeah, he's public about it. And he was the ADC to this Lieutenant General. I can't remember his name.
Okay, there's a different Lieutenant General.
No, this is John Alexander I'm talking about.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Colonel John Alexander.
Well, he's not the other Lieutenant General you talk. Oh,
no, the Lieutenant General
Oh, I see.
is one guy, and he's the brother of Lee Marvin.
Oh,
He's got an impossible German name. I can't remember.
All right.
But what happened then, this is all public stuff is the point. They were training people to do walking on fire, to do PK metal bending, because that's good stuff you should have if you're a soldier, right? And that was open. And Delta Force out at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania was kind of in charge of the whole thing. But now somewhere you should have heard about that, because that's all over the place, You could call up, Colonel John Alexander, and he'll tell you about
bending
it.
parties all over Washington.
Yeah.
My main experience with John Alexander was a PK party he and Jack Halp gave that I taped. And the best thing I got on tape was John Alexander bending a spoon behind his back. And when I showed him to him, he was pretty embarrassed. He didn't want.
That's cute.
But his justification was, well, you have to prime everybody.
Well, that's what
to
they
cheat a little
always
bit
say,
to prime them. But I never saw anything in any of those parties.
But the way they prep them, just so you know, the full mechanism, they get somebody who's a surefire metal bender, and he watches the audience, and he'll do it. I don't know whether they must have done it at your meeting. He'll just hold it up there and it'll bend, and everybody screams.
I've been to about 4 different PK parties, and I've never seen anything.
Well,
but I've seen a lot of
I've been to
lot of white
20 of
knuckles.
them.
I've seen a lot of white knuckles. But I mean, the ones I've been to are like at
You've never tried metal
conventions.
bending yourself?
Yeah.
It's easy to do.
Oh.
You can't do it?
No, but I'd like to see a demonstration today if you can do it. I can't.
No, I'm not here to...
At these parties, they're also very good at photographing all the participants.
Oh,
especially
sure,
the
they've got a
successful
complete
ones.
dossier and
Dossier,
everybody
all
is
the
there.
successful
And
ones.
most of the parties, just for your information, are not the ones they do around conferences like Jack Hawk was out at the Home Life Expo last week when I was there, and he was doing his thing. Most of them are done in Washington with government officials to convince them that this stuff is real. And the only way anybody can be convinced is if it happens to you.
But as a psychologist, I've observed this, and I don't think I've ever seen PK, but I have seen something.
Well, I mean, I don't know
I'll tell you
where
what
you've
I've
been.
seen.
I can...
But I'll tell you what I've seen.
Yeah.
What I've seen, and I've seen very reputable people bend metal, or think that they bent metal, and I watched them very closely, and I saw them bend metal, but what they were doing was applying force.
Yeah,
and
well,
I
that's
think
crooked. That's not
no,
legitimate.
it's not. But the point is, when you get into an altered state of consciousness, which I think what these group minds.
do, yeah.
I think you alter your state, you disassociate with your body, and what happens is you do things that your mind doesn't realize your body's doing.
Yeah.
And so you come back, and when you come back to your body, you find it's a bent object. I'm not saying the PK doesn't exist, but I'm saying there's a lot of garbage mixed in with it.
No
And Jack
question about it.
Jack Houck will dump a pillowcase full of spoons in front of you.
Cool,
They'll all
right.
be bent. 99% of them were bent by force.
Well, not necessarily.
But the
because-
point is, he doesn't tell you which are which.
No.
And he can't tell which are which.
No, what you say is true, but it's not the whole story. The good experiments, do you ever see John Hasted's book on metal bending? I mean, he did the most classic experiments in the world. Made a glass bulb with a little hole big enough to admit a regular clip, a paper clip, and usually use iron. And he got all these kids that had reportedly done this stuff into the lab. And I've been to the lab, I've seen the photographs, I've seen the kids. The kids do this, they drop the paper clip into the glass bowl, which can only go through when it's straight. If it's bent anyway, it won't go through. And as those things fall, they will start bending. And one kid can fill that thing with 50 or 60 paper clips, and they're all tangled up in a, did you ever see that work? I mean,
I've seen the book.
and then work beyond that. I'm talking about classic laboratory work. Is sealing metal in glass tubes, which are fire closed at each end. They're not the rubber cap, screw cap, and the object is put in there, and the psychic can do anything they want. They can press, they can puff, and they can huff, but they can't do anything. If they do, they'll break the glass if it's false. And the stuff disappears from inside the glass. And that's what really got the military scared. And secondly, the stuff will bend inside the glass, and usually they have neutron-activated material so that they can examine it later on and see what kind of stress and strain has been done. And I sent my original samples back in the 70s from Israel to, what's his name, Tiller at Stanford, who's head of material sciences. He said he'd never seen any samples that were bent this way. Here's a piece of metal, right? It's bent or it's broken, either one. One side of the gap will show extremely high temperature effects, puddling, pitting, and so on, like, you got an arc welder burning it. And the other side shows a cold freeze fracture with a crystalline. I mean, you've got to look at all the data and forget just the crookery part that, you're good at crookery, so you like crookery, but there is real data around that you got to look at. But get John Hasted's book. It's impeccable in terms of, the experiments done.
Wasn't he criticized, though, for leaving those orifices on the globes?
The orifices,
The holes.
they were open.
Well, I'm saying that...
But nobody you can't get a bent pin through the hole. That's the way it was designed. The pins would bend only after it got through. But it was open. Anybody could come and look at it. I mean, it was no big secret. And he's a very respected old square type physicist. He's not a flashy, magician type. No, there's experiments, and that's why the U.S. government has classified all these operations that are doing this kind of work. It's a very fundamental problem. Teleportation alone, anti-gravity. I remember a case that took Geller to Kent State University, and Wilbur Franklin was a physicist there, and he was kind of getting into psychic stuff in a very amateur way. I mean, he didn't really have any experience. But he was gutsy enough to get the whole physics department together at a meeting. They all sat around a huge conference table, and one guy was sitting opposite me, and Geller was over here. And he was the head of the department. He was giving everybody a hard time. This is bullshit. I don't believe it. Prove it to me. The usual type of reaction. And as he's talking, Geller just sitting because he gets used to this stuff. It rains on him all the time. In front of him, there was a glass ashtray between Geller and him. And as he's berating this whole thing, I swear, the thing levitates, and until it hits the guy's eye, he doesn't see it. Then it suddenly falls, so everybody saw it. But there's so many incidents of genuine phenomena, and I'm the first one to detect crookery. That's been done a lot of famous debunking of a lot of famous people because I don't like trickery more than anybody else does. I hate to be fooled, let's face it, it's a weakness in me. But anyway, I think you ought to look into it. Get somebody here who's a good metal bender who can spend a week with you and do it under your own conditions. And learn how to do it yourself.
Well,
no, I mean,
I've been in the field 7.5 years. I've never seen anybody bend metal,
But
and
that
I've been
doesn't
here
mean-
3.5 years, and I've never had anyone claim to be able to do it in my laboratory. One person recently called, and he was real excited, and he said he was doing all kinds of stuff. And the first thing I said, send me a videotape, because he said he had one. And as soon as I asked for something tangible, he disappeared.
Yeah, but you know, history is going to march by you if you don't see it.
I'm saying it's easier
Yeah.
said than done than to say bring these people in. I'm fine, bring them in. Where are they? I
No,
can't find
go
them.
for them. I mean,
Where?
make it your own mission.
Where are they? How come the government has access to all these people? If they have this big program, where are they getting the people from?
They're getting them from the general public. Where do you think they come from? They're not from Mars.
Do you have any metal benders in your subject population?
Are these people put on the payroll? Or,
Of course, they're all in the payroll.
I mean,
They're all-
these kids or whatever? I mean,
No, they're all, you know, all this started as kids back in the, early 60s and
how are they
70s.
taken care of? I mean, why can they speak about it?
No, they're all in the super secret orders. You can't get into an intelligence operation without giving up your life, you know that. Have you ever been in intelligence work in the military?
No, never have.
Well, try it, you know. You
But
can't-
what I mean is these kids, they have a choice of whether or not they want to do it.
Of course they do, but you know, every kid likes to be a Boy Scout with a big badge, so they
Yeah.
join the big father organization. You know, it's human nature.
The
That's
pay's
also
probably
part
good.
of the stuff you're talking about. They all want to be big shots, you know, but also under secret cover, you know. But don't you know any of these psychics who work for the government? No, they trust us. I know hundreds of them.
Where's Uri right now?
He lives in England.
Yeah. Do you still stay in touch?
Sure, you have to. But the problem with him is, you know, he's the chief of psychic warfare operations for Israel, and their security is so tight that he can't fart without their knowing it, you know. And so my meetings with them, I'm not part of their inner sanctum, are very cautious. We have to disappear somewhere and have our little conversations and so on. But Geller is probably the foremost PK operator that I know of. He can sit in his home in London and get a call from the intelligence and say, block the radar between, Israel and Uganda, and he'll sit there and he'll concentrate and he'll wipe them all out. Israelis get in, they get out, nobody sees them. Whenever they have a big bombing mission, remember the big raid on the nuclear reactor in Iraq? Israelis came and dropped the bombs right down the chimneys. Nobody saw them come, nobody saw them go. Uri joins every raid like that, and when he's in the plane with the lead pilot, the pilots and the rest of the formation can all talk radio. Nobody can hear him. Radar doesn't see him. He completely blocks out all radar. And this is everyday operational stuff. Very important to know about this. And that's only the beginning. The missile goes up, Geller can disable it and make it come right down. If there's a bunch of missiles, and I've gone through all these exercises with them on the Turkish border where the Russians have a lot of hydrogen bombs, he'll just concentrate and disable one of them. And what he does, we've examined it, he pulls out a vital fuse in each one, it won't fire. I mean, that's warfare today.
And it's so known. It's amazing that the people, some other people wouldn't want to wipe him out or take him out.
They do. He's under 24-hour security. Everybody's trying to wipe him out. It's a big operation to get rid of the opposing psychics.
So he's pretty stuck into what he's doing for.
He's locked for his life. He can't get out.
So no more U.S. visits or.
No, he traveled. No.
Yeah.
That made the situation clear. The Israelis decided, and the U.S. cooperates with them, just so you know, because they exchange intelligence. For example, there's a 6-day war. Israelis capture all the Soviet-made equipment and shipped to the U.S. and analyzed, they swap back and forth. So somewhere along the line, a decision was made in Israel, the same as was made in the U.S., that the way to prevent people from taking this kind of warfare seriously is to make a laughing stock out of the Gellers and the Hurkoses and Jean Pergiard and all the top operators in the world. And so the U.S. cooperates with the Israelis to make Uri look like an asshole, pardon the French again. I mean, that's a fixed part of their policy, and he plays up to it, and he plays the showman and the, queer kid and, all that stuff. So he can go anywhere in the world because nobody takes him seriously, except the intelligence people. But he's so closely, it would be pretty hard to kill him, I can tell you that, or poison him or kidnap him or anything.
Because of his knowledge or defense?
Well, his powers, his powers. And other countries feel the effect of, what he's doing. It's no joke if Israelis, like during the Suez Crisis in 72, and the world almost came to a war. Actually, Uri disabled when the Russians threatened the Israelis that if they don't pull out, they're going to blow them out and leave a big hole in the ground. And Uri disabled all the hydrogen bombs on the Russian border. There are 25 of them. I mean, this is the way war runs these days. Atom bombs are just not effective weapons anymore. It's real stuff.
I'd love to meet him someday.
Well, it's just another guy when you meet him, but when you get him in a lab and really, or in a military situation and see what he can do.
Yeah.
I had to persuade the Israelis don't believe anything, including their own mother. It took me months to convince them that this guy was for real. And he went through test after test you wouldn't believe.
He wanted that then, huh? He wanted to work for Israel that day?
He felt that he'd come to Earth only for that one job, to protect Israel.
Okay.
But he doesn't publicly believe that stuff.
Publicly, he says it's all bullshit.
Uri. About.
And I put him on spaceships, taking them off.
He doesn't agree with all that.
It's part of the military cover. Hurkos is the same way. He was the chief psychic for the U.S. government for some 26 years, till he died.
On the Heraldo show, Peter showed a card he had, Republican Psychic Task Force. Why Republican? Is he partisan or psychic or what? Or was he?
No, it was a presidential task force. He's working directly. He reported directly to Reagan.
To Reagan?
Yeah.
Now that we know about Nancy Reagan and astrology and stuff, makes sense.
Well, that was all a cover to throw out in case somebody found out that Reagan was talking to a psychic. That was an inside job by Donald Reagan. There's so much deception, misinformation going out. The average smart John Q. public doesn't know which is bullshit and which is the real stuff. If you know what they're doing in the game, you can, for example, if you read all these books that have come out about psychic warfare, McRae, John Wade, blah, 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 they're all full of propaganda. There's nothing real in them. You read them?
Oh, sure.
They don't know from borscht. They don't know nothing that's going on. Nothing. Yeah. They pick up a little bit of information here.
That's true to one extent.
To what?
I've got a chapter in one of those books that I can say is true to my extent.
Which book is it?
John White's. But it's a thing.
Oh, John White. I haven't read it. I just saw John White 2 days ago.
It was in Second Look years ago.
But John doesn't know, believe me.
I didn't know.
No, he doesn't know. Union, there are 8 of them ringed around a 60-degree latitude. And he called up actually Tom Bearden and said, Tom, I'm going to knock out the big transmitter at Riga. And he said, you watch. So Tom waited a couple of days, and the only news that came out was Chernobyl had blown out. Well, from where this guy lives on a Great Circle route, Chernobyl is a line of sight. And he claims that he did it. He's still alive. Nobody's killed him for it. But I know the technology is possible to do that because nuclear fuel happens to be very susceptible to ELF triggering. And that's really one of the big fears between the two sides is that some idiot, some amateur, and it's not hard to do, I know the circuitry, will start playing around and blow up some nuclear fuel pile or a nuclear reactor or something like that. It's a and of course submarines are the best target of all. So that is one of the real frightening aspects of modern warfare. The use of what they call scalar waves that interfere to blow up stuff. Real bad stuff. It's incidentally, and I know you won't believe this, Tesla discovered this method around 1900 of doing interference patterns with scalar waves to blow up things, and he proved it in an experiment in New York. And it's now state of art, and the Soviets have it. They can trigger any earthquake they want, and the U.S. has it. And a lot of these earthquakes that have happened recently, think of Armenia, think of the Quebec earthquake and so on. If you look at the natural geophysical signatures that they used to get on the old drums, they're quite different from the ones that are induced by ELF warfare. I mean, warfare has gotten to a point that it's if anybody knew, they'd go ape that, people in our government, other governments are doing these things. And there's always some idiot around who's going to trigger it, right? That's the way the world is. Some Hitler, some Gaddafi, some characters going to go out in the last big blast. So,
Yikes.
No, I'm telling you the truth, that these are real things.
Yeah.
And maybe you're happy, you're insulated from all this. You don't have to have nightmares or worry about it. Anyway, is it all right to go on, or do you want to take a break?
Well, you can go on a bit, sure.
Huh?
Let's go on some more.
Does one of your watches go forward in time and one go backwards in time?
No, this is the watch I developed. I'll describe it now to protect you against ELF.
Does it tell time?
Yeah, it's a real watch.
And what's the other one do?
Well, this is a very special watch. I worked with Peter Hurkos for 35 years, and we're like brothers, and a lot of the stuff I'm telling you I got from him because he was there and he knew it. And when he died, he left this for me. And if you know anything about psychometry, all of Peter's in that watch. So, very special object.
So that's your Tesla?
This is the Tesla, yeah.
Yeah.
Take a look at it.
So they're not making the Loran circuit anymore? Was it the Loran 8 Hertz oscillator for the watch?
Yeah, this has an 8 Hertz oscillator and puts out a scalar field, though.
Right, you use some sort of Mobius strip or something there.
Well, some of that, I made a quantized Hall semiconductor circuit which rotates the signals around so that I get a scalar field out of it. Let me go ahead with that since we're on that. Well, let me just back up a little bit here. As I said, 1972, I was really stuck because I've seen a lot of phenomena, but phenomena is confusing. Unless you have rationale for it, forget it, right? And you can't be a scientist unless you want to know what's behind the facade. I'm not interested in magic myself. And it had all these data points that I mentioned, but I wasn't getting anywhere. But in 1972, a psychic came to my lab, which was then in New York, Sharon Jacobson. I don't want to go into 17 years of work with her, but these are the bottom line findings. She could look at the quantum level of energetics of matter. She could watch a light beam hit a electron and describe. It took years to develop the entire dynamics of what happens and what the electron puts out when something comes in. And anyway, I was impressed with her. She's a movie producer, incidentally, in Hollywood. I mean, she's a regular person. Nobody knows she exists as a psychic and all that stuff. Woody met her because they're neighbors, and I introduced them and so on. But anyway, I spent the last 17 years working with her and I give her a problem. I take a sample of hydrogen gas as pure, and have her look at the hydrogen molecule and then tear it apart psychically, a PK, and look at the hydrogen atom. And then I'd have her look at the proton alone and look at the electron alone. And over these years, we've developed a picture of the internal structure. A proton has an incredibly complex inner structure, and I'll give that to you as I go along. But the reason that's important is that the proton is the source of ELF scalar fields, which incidentally are longitudinal waves and not transverse waves. And they are the information system between all particles in the universe, including the particles in our body and between bodies. And with her help, I was able to take healers and have her, when I was working with a patient, now she's an instrument that you can't duplicate, and I would have her look at where the ELF fields, what I was showing you before, are ELF fields, and again, scalars, okay? And I would have her find out where the scalar wave started, and she'd always track it down to a proton in the DNA helix, a specific proton. And she would track the field out through the body to the patient and find out where that field landed. And he asked me the question yesterday, which is a very good one. How do you direct this cockamamie missile, you know? Well, it turns out that ELF works strictly on one principle, frequency. Every ELF field has a frequency, and we can measure them now, and I hope the equipment over at Southwest is good enough to measure to at least 100th, if not 1,000th of a cycle, because in order to get pure resonance between the DNA here and the DNA here, and I'll go into physics of that later, you have to have accuracy to 3 decimal points. And if you want to activate the DNA system, which is what healers do, you have to activate the right portion of DNA that produces the right chemical output for the given disease, whether it be diabetes or encephalitis or bones or whatever. And so that's the thing we worked out. But it wasn't worked out on the bench or on people, because you can't see that stuff. And it took us years to develop good equipment to measure it. But here's what she could see in a nutshell. Hadrons are these massive particles, and we studied particularly protons because they seem to be controlled. She could freeze frame them. When she first looks at them, they're spinning little globules. You can't see a damn thing, right? It's all light from the spin. But I taught her how to look at it and clamp it with her mind, like you would clamp your hand on an object, or in PK you'd affect it, and she could stop it cold. And then she would study its inner structure, and that went on for years because it seems to be a bottomless pit. I can tell you right now we're 26 dimensions away from where we live, because it's as though space had little vacuums, and this is a favorite modern theory, and in that little vacuum you have the spin on various particles, and it's the vacuum, which is not really a vacuum, it's a structure in space. And you have to see it in that setting, and we have all kind of vocabulary for that, and hold it there to see what it does under certain conditions that you trigger, okay? Now, in that internal structure of the proton, she described 3 quarks. You've all heard about quarks, right? And quarks have never been seen, as you know. It's just still a theory, but there's some evidence they exist. Now, what she found out, that quarks were made up of 3, and I'll show you the pictures in a moment, what we call bound wave function. They're spin functions that have a rigid form. In other words, they don't change. And each quark contains 3 of these little spin functions, which we have finally identified after years of work as magnetic monopoles. Some of you may know from your reading that magnetic monopoles were predicted in 1932 by P.A.M. Dirac, who got the Nobel Prize for related work. And we have a very clear picture of the magnetic monopole. The magnetic monopole is the source of ELF fields. And secondly, and this is a very important point, there are 10 of these magnetic monopoles. Remember I cited earlier the little game we played with blocks, kid stuff. Turns out that the fundamental mathematics of the telephone system, dialing and switching, and the little box of 10 pictures, and the 10 monopoles inside of a proton, the source of all information, an incredible switchboard. It can handle an enormous number of contacts with other protons and electrons and so on. Now in the proton, besides the 10 magnetic monopoles she found, and I had to verify everything, and if I didn't understand it, we'd try to set up tests to prove it. The 10 magnetic monopoles are matched by a set of 10 anti-monopoles. They're all lined up inside this little bag model. And I already mentioned the fundamental probability set of 10 plus 10. The 10 work in phase. Now, this appears to be the basic alphabet of the universe. Or let's put it this way, if there weren't instantaneous communication between every part of the universe, and I'm talking about the universe beyond anything astronomers can see, the whole thing would collapse. If one quasar blew up and there was a chain reaction from bodies ready for a collapse, the whole thing could blow up because it would spread. But since there's communication between all particles, there's an anti-effect for every effect. And the entire process works, again I repeat it, by frequency. Every bit of information transferred is a function of frequency. And it's a very narrow band of frequency. It's not very big. It's a couple of thousand hertz, from microhertz all the way up to about 300. The biological part seems to work in a very narrow band, from maybe 0.2 of a hertz to about 15 or 16 hertz. You can push it up higher. 41 hertz happens to be a special notch. If you want to disable somebody permanently, and it's used in all warfare, and I've been a victim of it myself, you plant a little gadget in their bed or somewhere where they spend time, and it'll put out 41 hertz. Unless you have special equipment, you'll never detect it, and slowly it will destroy all the integrity of calcium bonding in your body. And pretty soon the calcium runs out of your nerves, and you begin to get twitchy, and it runs out of your muscles, and you shrink to nothing. I went from 180 pounds to 150 pounds, and I was like 90 years old in about 9 months of radiation from ELF. So I know the whole story intimately, what happened.
So you think this came out of calcium efflux studies?
The what?
You think this came out of calcium efflux studies?
Yeah. You know, calcium is a critical element in integrating particularly neural function and DNA function and so on. It's a very critical element. Most people don't think of it that way, but it's regulatory. But I can get rid of anybody I want to.
What would you be diagnosed as?
There's no diagnosis.
In other words, if
I
you
had
went to the hospital in that condition, they couldn't tell you?
No, I'll tell you exactly what I did. I have one of the best physicians in the United States. His name is Harold Bernstein. He's professor of internal medicine at UCLA in his department. He's also the chief physician for the Saudis. They have a whole hospital in Riyadh that's only for the royal family. It sits there empty all the time. And when they have trouble, they call up Harold, and he flies over and takes care of the problem. They have no damn hospital sitting by for the royal family. But he was a brilliant guy. So I went to him because I go to him every year for an annual, and he has a long, profile on me. I didn't tell him what was wrong. He went absolutely bananas. He could not make a diagnosis. He could verify that the muscles were weak, that the pulse rate was slow, and that the travel time of reflexes was delayed and everything. But he could not understand it, because from one examination to the time I came, it's about 6 months, as I said, I lost 30 pounds, and I was ready for the basket, blubbering case. And the short-term memory went. I mean, it was incredible what happened. I have a whole article that I'll never publish, I'm sure, written what happens when one thing is interfered with. So that's the kind of thing that is very, very big in not psychic warfare, but ELF warfare these days. And I'll tell you how bad it is. I mentioned this to you yesterday. The CIA and the FBI worked together on this, have worked out methods where they can inject ELF in your telephone line, and depending on what they want to do, it should depress you, make you manic, or make you go bananas, or just make you deteriorate. You can't detect it unless you have special equipment. The ELF comes in the phone 24 hours a day. I was very fortunate. I monitor my whole lab every day for all this kind of stuff. And I found it the first day it came in. And they had decided to use 6.00 hertz, which shows you in a real deep depression. Anyway, it's rough stuff, but it's real.
What kind of amplitude are you talking about for 41 hertz? Since I assume that's ambient in their environment, to have biological effects, I assume you'd have to create some kind of local field that would be strong enough.
Yeah, it's very local.
How small or how large would that field have to be?
It depends. If it's being beamed from Soviet Union and they want to, let's say, hit San Antonio as example, they can take two transmitters and like FM, they can phase array them and point them towards San Antonio. And from Soviet Union, the beam is about 42 miles wide. Very strong. But when I say strong, we're dealing in less than microvolts, number one. Nanovolts. The actual active component is the scalar pulse. Okay? I'll show you some pictures of it. A scalar pulse, and it is down to the level, you know, the new unit of international magnetism is a Tesla. A Tesla, for those you don't know, is equivalent to 10,000 Gauss, which is pretty weak in itself. And so we measure these pulses at about the level of 10 to the minus 9th Tesla. That means a billionth of a Tesla, and usually it's from 1 to about 10 that we can measure.
Milligauss?
So that's
No, it's beyond milligauss. Yeah, milligauss would be
nanotesla, so it's
it would
10
be,
to 20 nanotesla.
yeah, it would be a millionth of a Gauss. It's pretty weak.
Microgauss.
So you weren't kidding when you said you need special equipment to detect this.
Well, it took me years to develop it. I can't do it out in, I mean, I can do it in the open. I can show it to you right now. I have some equipment with me. But it's very crude. To get precise measurements, I have to be inside of a tremendous Faraday cage, and that little circuit I showed you is the pickup. And I have to screen out, like this room, I hate to say it, is full of all kinds of electromagnetic interference. I'll just show you quickly so you get an idea of the magnitude of these things.
I thought you were just using the Beck coil to measure some of these very small things. But do you have your own equipment now that you've built?
I built it, although you can't buy it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, you have to, now this is a Sony synthesized shortwave receiver, and I modified it
Well, I have
to
one.
pick up ELF, and I carry it wherever I go.
By
It
the
looks
way,
like-
Andrea, this
Huh?
morning
What?
I was listening to WWV on 10 megahertz, and I heard the woodpecker.
You did?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
I taped it for you.
That's terrific.
That's the first time I've heard it, and
Well, it's been off the air since
It's back.
September 1st, so they must be back on the
they
air.
must have been retuning.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, this is very simple, and when I go abroad and so on, it looks like it's like a regular
Yeah.
radio.
I have that radio.
Yeah, it's a great one.
Yeah.
Nobody bothers me, you know. But anyway, I'll turn it on, and this is just a loudspeaker, okay? And it's at a carrier frequency of 153 kilohertz. Now let me just show you, you know, hear it now, right?
Yeah.
Oh no, those lights are disgusting.
It's rough stuff, boy. You got some telephones on, turn on the Xerox machine.
Is that connected to your
What's
phone
on
now?
the floor over there?
What?
What's that?
Oh, the power strip? This thing here? Slightly.
No, it's weak, but that's just static. Yeah, not real stuff. Anyway,
Did you say your watch is producing something?
it's producing 8.00
Can this pick it
hertz.
up?
No, this is too weak a field to pick it up. We won't pick it up. Oh.
Well, that's
I
just
think there must be an interaction there. Yeah, I can only measure this in a shielded room. This is not sensitive enough to pick up the 8 hertz. Have to have very special equipment for this.
This is what I have a question about, because you said that you were being affected by this 41 hertz field, but according to you, this watch would protect you from anything else.
Yeah, but I wasn't wearing it.
Oh, you weren't wearing
This is
it.
before I developed
Oh, I see. Okay.
Well, now I don't worry about things like that. But just sitting in here, computers, I mean, are deadly. 9.75 hertz, and they cause spontaneous abortion in women and men. Let's face it, they just go sterile. This has all been documented. Had the Canadian Royal Medical Society work on this. But this is the shit we live in. It's everywhere. You can't escape it. And it's not intentional. A lot of it is totally unconscious. In other words, it's built in a video display terminal on your TV or a computer, right? There's something called a flyback transformer in it. And the flyback transformer is kind of essential method of focusing the electron beam and so on. It arises out of there, you know. And nobody's going to redesign all television sets. I don't know how many millions there are, billions in the world. So nobody talks about it. But you go to IBM experts or any of the big companies, they all know about the problem. They can't solve it. They keep trying to shield it by putting gamma ray shields on the screen, you know, because there's gamma rays coming off the phosphors and stuff. That doesn't do a damn bit of good, because the stuff that really does the damage is this ELF. And ELF will go through the body just as though it's glass, but certain protons will pick up the signal, and they all happen to be in the DNA. Anyway, that's just a little sideshow, but show you these things are real. But now let's get into the guts of the thing.
But to get back to something we talked about yesterday, the frequency is the critical thing.
Yeah, that's it. All the information is in the frequency.
Right, so distance is irrelevant.
No, distance has nothing to do with it, because if I start an ELF wave from this watch,
Because they're so long.
it'll just go on throughout the universe. It won't
Well,
attenuate.
that's my point. If you have a ELF generated in the Soviet Union of 8 hertz, that should affect someone who's there or who's here equally.
Absolutely, it does.
If you hit the right frequency.
Absolutely, it does. Yeah. People at the transmitting station, the people at the receiving end, wherever they may be, animals, plants. I'm sure you've all read, to at least my great distress, since ELF warfare started about 12 years ago, you read over and over again about whales beaching themselves, and dolphins getting weird diseases that look like AIDS, and seals dying what they now establish as distemper virus. And on it goes through thousands of species in the sea. And
You wrote a book about that, didn't you?
well, it's been classified by the FBI for 12 years. They can't get it out.
Is that global magnetic warfare?
Yeah, and so on, yeah. Nobody wants this. No, I sell them on my own. I just like to challenge the establishment, but they haven't stopped me on that one. They burned my lab down once, but I raised such a stink they didn't try that.
There's one point I'm not clear about. You said, what William just said, is that the frequency is critical. If it's produced in the Soviet Union, we should experience it here. But isn't it contingent on the amplitude of the frequency?
No.
In other words,
There's something about
microvolt signal would be propagated across the other side of the
it
world?
does not attenuate like an electromagnetic signal, no.
That's what bothers me, Andrea.
A lot of studies have been done.
If we do our own little in-house experiments with this, we're affecting the whole planet by turning the thing on.
Yeah. Well, it depends now how good your ELF generator was now. A lot of ELF generators are kind of not the real McCoy. They don't produce a true scalar field. I don't know, what was the generating source in your ELF generator?
I'm not doing that.
No, we're talking hypothetically now.
Oh, I thought you said
No,
you
no,
were
no,
done.
We've got
I
some, based on Bob Beck's designs. that-
Oh, yeah, okay, Bob Beck is a
Yeah.
good
Is there-
expert on this area,
But,
right.
like this thing, this is generate scalar?
No, this is a receiver only.
No, the watch.
This generates a pure scalar wave.
Okay, well, if you're wearing it,
Yeah,
you're protecting yourself.
yeah.
But why does it matter if you're wearing it if it's distance dependent? Why can't that
What do you
be
mean?
This is independent.
It's not
distance independent, excuse me.
You can leave it at home and it should
Yeah,
protect you.
that's what bothers me, that on the one hand, you're saying it seems to be localized, the field, to protect an individual.
Yeah, but there's reasons for that, which I can explain.
Okay.
Again, we have to get in the area of credibility. Have you ever done any work with psychics who can see the aura? Okay, they can see it, and we did that study many years ago, in which we used a psychic, who was a Dutch lady, who could see auras, but she could give a precise medical diagnosis and describe what was going on. So this was done with a bunch of doctors in New York. And we were convinced after studying several hundred patients that she could look at them and make an accurate diagnosis just by looking at the field around the body. Okay, you just have to accept that as a given data point. Now the interesting thing about auras, they don't extend infinitely. They have a kind of envelope. And that's why I call this this company the Elf Cocoon, because psychics would observe this and we could measure it. Quote. Now let me give you how we measured it first. A psychic will only see the field, like that at the most. Okay. But then you can take a dowser and have this thing switched on and off, and the person wearing it, not wearing it, and so on. And when you wear this thing, the field will extend to about 7 or 8 times the normal field by dowsing. And then if you go with super fine detectors, you can measure a little further, about 72 feet. But that's the boundary of this field. But I want to get your thinking in line. You're thinking of a little radar beam that's going out to the horizon, right? It's not that nature, you see. The nature is that it's based on a resonance. This resonates with the body, okay? There may be loss of the field beyond that, but it resonates the field that is normally associated with the aura. That's a critical point. The aura keeps it in a boundary, and because the field of the aura in my book is an ELF field, and it has very special characteristics based on resonance between this proton dipole and that one, and it has a kind of a curved path. That's the critical point. It goes back. So it's the physics of it is really quite straightforward if you get measurements on the thing.
Is there a handedness to the scalars, or
We don't know.
Okay, because I remember there's this little pamphlet Pat Flanagan put out about it. He had something like that. He was using a Mobius antenna, supposedly. A left-handed twist was good, right-handed was bad.
Yeah, you can do it with, I originally started out about 7 years ago with the Mobius loop to see what it would do, and I found out that it could capture the ELF fields and put them into the circular mode, and from that I went through circuit design after circuit design. Eventually wound up, and I'll show you the diagram of what a quantized Hall semiconductor circuit looks like.
But he was trying to say, if you use a left-handed twist on the antenna, that was okay, but if you use a right-handed twist, it was very deleterious. But the left-handed twist on his antenna would
I'll tell you what goes on there. First place, I'm sure, like most people, he didn't do any measurements to see what was deleterious. It's like, I don't know if you've ever gone to this new age doctor stuff with the muscle tension test. It's pure shit. When we get Michael Androv here, I will show you. He'll do it because he's a master. He will take your hand and test it, and anybody can test it, and it'll answer yes or no properly, okay? And then he just thinks a thought, which is his private thought. You're full of shit, man. And your arm goes limp. And he can totally control your reaction, and most people who use this practice, they're grading their own papers. So it's a interesting phenomena, but it's useless for any objective measurement. So that's probably what these guys did. But I would have this psychic that I'm describing describe the field, okay? And here's what we found, both by description and then checking it separately. We found out that if the left hand is used as an emitter of ELF, that the signal would spiral in one direction, usually clockwise, this way. If you look at it, it would be this way. And if you send it in the opposite direction, it wouldn't go out that way, which is surprising. It would go up the body. And then it would come out the other arm. And if you study a lot of healers, you will find invariably that healers use the left hand to diagnose disease. And you'll see this when Michael gets here. And they use the right hand to put out the energy to do the healing. It's a very subtle, important difference. And the reason is that there's a magnetic flux that circulates. I say magnetic, it's really scalar, that circulates in the body, which is part of the aura, from here, the emitter, all the way around, and goes back to the chest, in the same way with the legs and the arms. If you go back to some of the ancient literature, like Leadbeater and so on, you'll find they observed all this stuff very precisely. And if you want to start at the beginning, their 1895 publication called Occult Chemistry is mind-blowing. They actually anticipated all of modern quantum mechanics. Nobody recognized it. They anticipated all the chakra structure of the body, the meridian flow, and they actually saw, the only other literature source I've found, they actually saw what this girl Sharon is now seeing today, although they had no language. When they did this, electron was not known, a proton was not known, nothing was really known. Fields were like barely discovered by Hertz and predicted by Maxwell and so on. So they used kind of clumsy Hindu theosophical language, but the paintings are correct, is what I'm saying. I don't know if that answers the question, but you know, this is really like hairy stuff in terms of like looking at spiderweb designs, you know. They're very different. Okay, it's okay to go ahead? If you're tired, we can knock off.
The place we're going to eat is very crowded until about 1, so when we go till 1,
so,
then we
okay,
can
Are you tired?
I don't get tired. I don't work hard, you know.
Okay.
I don't get tired. Okay. I've given you the basic pattern of what this lady observed, and I'll just finish it.
Andrija, did you discover occult chemistry after?
I only discovered it 2 years ago. I was giving a lecture in Philadelphia, Minneapolis, and it was very funny. I was staying as a guest at the house of the president of the Theosophical Society, and I was lecturing just for one day at their thing and somewhere else the other days. And he said, this thing came in the mail. I don't know what the hell it's all about. It's all mathematics. Maybe you could read it. And I said, okay, I'll read it later. So that night I went to bed, started reading the thing. And what it was, it's a book called, you got to get this, called Extrasensory Perception of Quarks. Okay? And it's written by a British physicist named Stephen Phillips. And it's published by Quest Publishing, which is Theosophical Publishing House on. And I began to read this stuff. And the first 100 pages are a little difficult because it's all mathematical analysis of work which hadn't been described yet. But I could read the math and see where it was going. And finally I get to pages where I open them up, and there in front of me is the same stuff that this young girl, who was very naive in terms she had no degree, no education, anything, had been doing. And then I would realize that, thank God, somebody had done all this, you know. And that we had somehow we made improvements because you have to know what you're looking for. That was my role. You know, I'd say, okay, there's a proton, but there's a field around it, and there's one electron, and what's it doing? And, you know, I brought in elements from, you know, neutrinos and things that weren't known in those days. And, of course, magnetic monopoles is not even thought of in 1895. But they described the same thing. Amazing.
Hal Puthoff gave a talk on that.
Yeah, I communicated some of this to Hal. When did you hear Hal talk about it?
About 2 years ago.
2 years ago? Yeah, that's when I last saw him. Yeah, he's into this area too. Of course, we can't talk about it, otherwise his credibility is gone, right? The Galileo syndrome.
Well, he doesn't really have to worry too much about his credibility. I mean, people know that he's into psychic phenomena. So.
Well, I don't worry about it either. I say all kind of things. People don't understand it or disbelieve it. That's not my problem. That's their problem. Anyway, in classical research, you get a hypothesis. Okay, you know this. And then you've got to test the hypothesis. You know, like Einstein said that light will bend around the gravitational field of a massive body like the sun. They said this in 1905. Nobody knew what the hell to do with Einstein, but the British were astute enough to at least do an experiment. So there was a big eclipse of the sun over Africa, and they measured it, and sure enough, light did bend around the sun. Suddenly, Einstein became a hero, but up to that point, it thought, oh, nice little old German professor, you know, he's dotty on tobacco or whatever he's taking, all that stuff. But it takes proof. So anyway, that's my attitude too. So we had these elegant theories of what happens, and we could watch the dynamics, not me, but through her eyes, and sometimes I'd get into the same pool of thinking as she did and could see the same thing. So my proof of any theory is to do a definitive experiment. So I spent about 7 years designing a generator for ELF. And I didn't do just what Bob Beck does. Bob Beck, you know, he's a good guy and I respect him. But he takes a classical magnetic field from a transformer and bucks it with another magnetic field, equal frequency, but 180 degrees out of phase. So when they buck each other like this, the electric and magnetic vectors disappear, and the only thing you have left is the longitudinal wave, which we call the scalar wave. And so that's kind of a dirty way. So I try to do it clean, okay? Important problem. So I'll show you what I did briefly, and then I'll give you the mechanism of all this gadgetry. Let's see if I can describe. If I lose you, just holler, because we're here to understand each other, right? Okay, what I did, I started out with a crystal oscillator because I wanted a pure electric field. I wanted practically no magnetic contamination. There is some in the quartz crystal, but it's minimal. And it has a resistor here and a capacitor. By fixing these values, it's being driven by a battery. You can control the frequency of oscillation. They're just standard electronics. And out of it came an 8 hertz E field, pure electric field. And this is all measured on the scope. And jumping over a lot of stuff, I built a Faraday cage out of copper, sheet copper, and inside of it, I'll do that. I'll show you what I did inside the circuit.
That's unipolar E field?
Yeah, it's one-sided unipolar, right?
Any reason why you wanted to?
It's very important. I couldn't work with a double-sided field. It had to have one side or the other. Okay, now I'm looking at this now, right? The Faraday shield.
Oops.
I don't know whether you can follow all this. Eventually, jumping ahead of years of experimentation, I found out that certain watches have a crystal that's designed to be a pure harmonic oscillator. Now, I don't know how many of you know anything about watch design. I find out that watch designers don't know much about it either. But a good quartz crystal, I'll just jump back here, in a watch. Now here's the oscillator I mentioned already. And if you measure the amplitude of a quartz oscillator, the right cut, just to give you a clear picture, I don't know how many of you are aware of it, but if you hit a drum, it puts out all frequencies. I've done spectral analyses of drum. If you hit an iron bar, it'll hit all frequencies in a harmonic sequence, not just one tone. People don't realize the noise spread of these harmonic oscillators. Now the perfect harmonic oscillator crystal, if you hit it at any of these frequencies, either one or up the top here, you'll put out the whole range of frequencies. The difference between one crystal and the other is the amplitude of the various frequency components. So here, let's just say I hit it at one ping once a second, it will oscillate all these frequencies, and these are harmonics, a double of the previous frequency. So you have 2 hertz, 4 hertz, 8 hertz, 16 hertz, 32, 64, 128, 256. The Greeks knew all this from their string studies, Pythagoras and so on. 512, 1024, 248, 4096, 8192, 16384, and all that watchmakers are interested in is this frequency. They try to make it with they try to make it with a large amplitude. All watches in the world are driven at 32,768 cycles, okay? Frequency, hertz. So what I had to do was the following. By this time I was really an expert on Faraday cages. I knew which frequencies would pass, even if they're electric frequencies. Extremely low frequencies from, let's say, 16 or so down, it's called a roll-off thing, will pass through a Faraday cage. So what I wanted to do is to build a Faraday cage, and that's this little wafer I'm showing you, through which this set of frequencies, 2 to about 64, will pass, and that becomes apparent later on. But they have to come out, again, this is another trick, in what's called an impulse wave. An impulse wave is like a power spectrum of any frequency distribution, and if you look at it upside down, this would be the power spectrum of the frequencies coming through, and the 8 hertz would be like a deep frequency, and these would be sidebands, okay? So this is classically known in quantum mechanics as an impulse wave. So I go back to the actual gadget itself now. What I did, and don't ask me the 10,000 wrong turns I made to achieve this. I mean, after all, it was all empirical. There was no maps you could follow in terms of mathematics. So what I did, I built this small little Faraday shield which fits very neatly inside the back of the watch case. Inside I had the Hall semiconductor effect. This is a 1 mil thick aluminum foil, or it could be copper foil, but it turns out aluminum is a little better. And I would coat it on each side with ferric oxide, okay, and on the other side. And so if a signal comes through here, it generates a current which goes through the, oh, I'm sorry, can you not see it? It goes through this layer here, and that current is the Hall semiconductor current. And then that current will go out on the other side, and these incidentally are magnetized very much like an audio or video ferric oxide tape, okay? And it's the equivalent, what's going on here, of a Mobius loop, but it's micro scale. And so the ELF signal, which is now 8 hertz and has a certain spread here from about 1 to 64, will pass through all this crystal array, and it's hard to see, but basically when the electric field goes through here, it rotates 90 degrees, that's the current flow. The 90 degrees essentially inside the ferric oxide looks like a magnetic field, and when it comes out it rotates another 180 degrees. So when you've done the 180 degree phase shift, you come out with a scalar field. That's the secret of making a real scalar field. All it is a longitudinal field, just like sound waves going through water and that sort of thing. So that's the essence of the circuitry without, you know, setting up a whole seminar on the circuitry. And let me jump here a little bit. Call the whistle when you're ready. This is what Sharon Jacobson sees as the magnetic monopoles. We found out that Bazant and Leadbeater had seen the same thing, and this is their published version. Ours is different because we have all the colors included of each of these bands and lines. I'm sorry, you got it? Thank you. So what's cute about this, and this is a very unique design in nature, of course nobody's ever seen it except the clairvoyants, because you're looking multi-dimensions away from four-dimensional world that we measure in. But what's interesting about this, just follow this very closely. This is the positive thing, and positive usually in Western parlance means clockwise, right? That's just the convention. Now watch, this field goes inside and circular, it comes a caduceus type of coil, right? And it comes out here, And I think I lost it here. Anyway, it comes out
It'd be
here.
easier for you to look up
Yeah.
there too.
And then it goes around this way and comes out here. So that's a positive, and that we've determined is the North Pole. Again, a convention doesn't mean a damn thing. And if it goes in the opposite direction, which you see here, that is a South Pole. Now what's cute about this, and I really love the intricate design of quantum mechanical level of nature, is that this is a stationary structure. In other words, a stationary wave, like any standing wave. But it has both the negative and positive magnetic fields in it, but nature is very cute and tucked one field inside the South Pole, and we only see the effect mathematically. But it fits all the criteria set down for what a magnetic monopole should be. So these are the ultimate 10 particles plus the antiparticles inside the proton. Now here's another thing I want to show you real quickly. Let me start over here. First place, all of you know, I mean, this is old hat. DNA is made up of 4 separate nucleotides: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine, and they have this structure. But here's the critical point. In the base pair structure of the double helix, here's the different things. Here's cytosine and here's guanidine. They go in certain pairs. You know that. That's all high school textbook stuff now. But here's the critical element, and Linus Pauling was really the first one to work this out, that these 2 bonds between the single helices are made up of nucleide here, but they are held together by a hydrogen bond. And this hydrogen bond is a pure proton because you have an electron here and you have an electron here. It's shown better here. The 3 dots, one is the proton, the other, and that's a pure resonant bond. Now that is an ultra-fine tuning device, which is what makes ELF work and scalar waves. If you want to produce a chemical, I don't care what it is, you name the 10,000 chemicals, you have to have the exact resonant frequency for a given point. And if you have it, this bond will break. It's a resonant point, you throw it off, resonant break. When that happens, then the thymine and the adenine send a signal to the RNA, and the RNA sends a signal to the next part of the chain, and then you have a chemical output. And we have a program on, it's been on for 2 years at the Max Planck Institute for Molecular Biology in West Berlin, and they've worked out all these details on a little organism called E. coli. So this is the origin, very important, of the ELF signal in healing. I don't know about a lot of other things. That's still to be determined. And it's the receptor, and it all works by resonance. And that's why you can take a 41 hertz signal and knock the hell out of anybody by putting a certain chemical out that dissolves the what they call the receptor, the thing that holds the protein basket that holds the calcium. So that's the basic phenomena, and every point has a different thing. Now you may know there's been this big discussion for the last several years about genomes, and finally a couple of weeks ago Congress and National Science Foundation worked up a program. They picked Jim Watson, who originally designed the double helix, etc., along with Crick, to start mapping these genomes. Each one of these is called a genome. That means it's a law unto itself, like no means law. And it is estimated, purely an estimate, that DNA inside the nucleus of every cell is about 1 meter long. It's like a little cobweb. It's what it is when you pull it out and stretch it. And it's springy, and when you let it go into the little tight spirals. On that little stretch, and this is going to stretch your imagination, there are estimated to be about 6 billion genomes. Each one of those is critical in any biological organism. In human beings, we know about 400 only, after all these years of research. And there's all these billions to be looked at. And the theory prevailing amongst biologists is that all of life's patterns, from the lowliest virus, which is a crystalline structure, to bacteria, all the way up the line to big elephants and giraffes and all that kind of weird creature, whales, all have the same blueprint setup. The only difference between one species and the other is a certain octave in one species, another octave in another, and so on and so on. But we don't even know how many different species can be formed that we may not know for hundreds of years. But if you know the code, that's its secret. You could recreate a dinosaur or mastodon or any long-lived species because the fundamental information is there. It's really a mind-boggling thing in biology, much more mind-boggling than the stuff. Okay, let me come to a conclusion on this. So this is the gadget that we hope that you have at Southwest, that we can use to measure the actual spectrum output of the hand. Now this is the control. Now this is all in a Faraday cage. Everything is triple shielded. The Hewlett-Packard analyzer is outside so we don't contaminate the air with noise. And the coupling, which I didn't mention before, with the magnetic coil, is water, plain old tap water that has certain, other atoms in it besides H2O. And so it's the best impedance match between the hand and the circuitry, okay? Gives us the highest gain, the least noise. What you're seeing here is nobody's in the cage, and this is the noise here, okay? This is a 25 hertz bandwidth. From here to here is 25 hertz, every square. This way, every two of these squares is 10 dB. So we don't look at anything unless it's at least 10 dB above the noise level. So the noise level, as you can see, is about 5 dB average here. This is the junk coming in from all over the cosmos, because it isn't stopped by the cage. It comes in, but it's not a big signal, and we can, put it in the noise category. So this we put in here as a 10 dB from here to here marker, even though we get a digital readout, but we want to know on the scale and the amplification. This is 8.6 hertz, so everything is measured on this area here. Here's one little pip. Now that may look like nothing to you, but it's 12.2 hertz, and it's a Soviet ELF signal that was on at that moment. I know how to look now for what the U.S. is putting out with Israel, because all this stuff goes all over the earth and you can pick it up. Now the interesting thing here is when a person, this happened to be my hand, puts his hand on the water thing, you absorb this signal in your body and it doesn't show up here, it's gone, and this has been tested thousands of times. So the body is a very good absorber, that's a lesson of that. But unfortunately the signal disappears, which means it's been absorbed by resonance into some part of your DNA, which is the unhappy part of the story. Now look what happens when, I'm not nobody special, I'm a lab worker basically. And you see here that I have peaks at 6.3 hertz, 7.3 hertz, and this is again a marker signal that we put for this experiment, so that one doesn't count. But now look at a healer. This is a healer who works in my lab, a young lady who's been healing for a number of years. And look at the signal in her body. We're starting here with 0, and at 3.1 hertz we have practically 10 dB, about 15 dB gain, a very narrow peak. Okay. At here, 6.2 hertz, she has another peak, but there's a little sideband which we didn't specifically measure. And then we have, at the bottom here, we have 7.0, here we have 7.7. We're looking at both the positive and negative phases. And over here, she has, which I didn't mark, right here there's a 9.3 hertz signal. This again is a marker. So interestingly enough, in this healer you have a harmonic sequence, which is a half harmonic, 3.1, 6.2, and 9.3 hertz here. And so on it goes with the studies, and we'll be looking at a lot of these if we get this thing launched here. What comes out of the healer, and most important, the resonance, like I showed you the chart of the 8 hertz with the healer and the healy. We want to see if these frequencies really drive the DNA of the person who's the healee. And then we want to know another more subtle thing, we may not have the equipment to do it, to see if when the healer touches the healee, whether they're sending out distress signals, something's wrong with my liver, something's wrong, blah, blah, and whether the ELF's picked up by the healer and then retransmitted back to make a spectrum for that given disease. We don't know all this stuff, you see. A lot to be learned, just on the first rough cut through the bush. Okay, one last point then.
I have a question. Would the hydrogen bonding and the water change during this? When the healer...
It does change because people like Doug Dean and a few others I know, and there's an enormous 6-volume work by a guy named Felix Frank. A lot of studies have been done about the resonance at ELF frequencies, and a guy at MIT, I don't remember his name right now, published a work in which he found 10 hertz resonance in water samples. So that we know is a peak line with the experimental setup he had. I just assume, I don't know for sure, it's hard to measure, well, let me put it in another way. I just want to answer your question clearly because it's a very important question. I work with a healer in Israel whose name happens to be Israel Carmel. And I started working with him, God, I don't know, about 1974, and whenever I go to Israel, I catch up on data and so on. And he found out quite by accident that when he held a bottle of water, it happened to be Avion water, had nothing to do with it, we just happened to have it, that by accident one of his patients thought he had told her to take it home, and she had a real bad cerebral problem. And she came back about 3 weeks later and said, oh, that water was wonderful. So what are you talking about? I said, well, I thought you left that bottle for me in the entrance. I said, no, I didn't leave the bottle for you. So, well, I took a little bit of it every day, and anyway, checked her out, and her cerebral problem is really kind of probably an early onset of Alzheimer's, I don't know for sure. And so he began to experiment with it. So he called me up excited. I said, come over to the United States, get in the lab, and we'll measure what you do to the water. And we found out that he did imprint an 8 hertz signal on the water, okay? And I have stuff on the shelf now for about 2 years to see how long it takes to decay. And I've done my own experiments now from a purely medical point of view of checking the validity of what he does in Israel. And most cases, I'd say 9 out of 10 with all sorts of weird backgrounds will get well by taking about 3 teaspoonfuls of water a day. So something happens and it lasts, but again, we don't have a lot of precise data on it. Like the kind of stuff that would be done by a classical physicist in terms of measuring the spectrum of all sorts of things. Douglas Dean's work only had to do with the OH bond, bending of the bond angle. He never looked in the ELF, but I've talked with Douglas recently, and he's going to try to get somebody in, he's up in Princeton to look at it with an ELF spectrometer and see what happens. There's a lot there to be done that we haven't done yet. Yeah.
If this water can, once it's imprinted with an 8 hertz signal, can actually have some kind of physiological effect, wouldn't it logically, isn't it possible to overdose on it? If you drank the whole bottle, could it have deleterious effect? I'll tell you
what, if you take too much, and I've only gone up to 1 cup, 8-ounce cup, you get a massive diarrhea. The body wants to get rid of this stuff. And I've had people on that, and all they have is toxicity from diarrhea, loss of fluids and salts and so on and so on. I've never seen everybody, pass out from it. But you can't overdose. That's why we worked out this dose of a little teaspoon.
The other thing I wanted to ask was, before you said
I have to go. I'm sorry. I really wish I had some questions. Would you ask them for me when you get a chance?
Think
You're
about
not
it.
going to have lunch?
Ask the one that burns it the most. I'll answer it real quick. What's the one that bothers you the most?
Oh, you couldn't answer my questions real quick, but not these
Why?
questions. I really wanted to hear some more about the experiences you had with the extraterrestrial.
Oh, that's a whole different
I know,
story.
that's what I'm saying. It couldn't be quick, but it was something I like to follow.
It's a whole universe in itself.
Well, I mean, I'll never hear it. But,
you have to leave? You're not coming
yeah,
back?
well, how long are you going to be here?
Well, I'll leave tomorrow, right after lunch.
Will this meeting continue this afternoon? Or
It's up to the
probably
boss
not?
here.
I think we're,
You're going to disband?
yeah, I think we're... Why don't you come back sometime?
This afternoon?
You're from Surf, are you? Or?
No, here.
Nothing but
Oh, you're from here. Oh, I
Yeah.
see. Break all your other appointments. Come
Yeah,
on.
you think so? Okay, well, I certainly work on it, and I'll give a call and see if you guys are around, and if so, I'm going to come back. I have someone that can take over maybe about 2 or 3 if y'all will still be around.
Okay.
Do you mind talking about that with me?
I don't mind. I mean,
Oh,
all
my
my
God.
colleagues will think I'm crazy, but,
That's
you
okay,
know.
let it that. It's okay if they think that. I'll see you later.
I'm used to it. Doesn't bother me. It's okay.
My question was, when you had your hand on the water, where you said your body then absorbed the 8 hertz signal,
Yeah.
and you said that could have effects directly on the DNA.
Yes, it does.
I assume, again, that has to be over a certain time course. In other words, if it were, say, a microsecond, it wouldn't have the same effect as if for an hour.
I don't know because when you,
Or is it not just on
no,
off?
what I'm saying is when you measure human physiology, time is, you can't really measure
Yeah,
it.
but you could do it in situ, like put in the cells in the test tube
A
and...
lot of studies have been done. That study is done in Max Planck Institute that I mentioned, and they probably have data on the reaction time because it's a Petri dish and it's a E. coli, which is very well known, and they radiate it for a certain period of time, but they don't time the how long it takes because it's a mass reaction thing in which they put in the ELF and then the chemicals come out and they analyze them spectroscopically and then they project them immediately on a huge screen that shows which part of DNA was activated. But I don't think it was relevant yet in their studies, the reaction time.
But then I assume if you sweep across the whole spectrum, then you get different chemicals coming out for every... It's like a signature of every frequency.
Right. And then, no, it's much more hairy than this.
It's a miracle we're alive, isn't it?
Well, I worship DNA. That's my religion because I want to meet the little old guy up there in the sky somewhere who's designing this stuff for billions of years, you know. It's incredible.
Yeah.
And it's just plastic, rubbery, watery stuff, you know. But it's got such integrity. You know, we don't evolve very much in 1,000 years, you know. We don't. And very few creatures evolve quickly. And it absolutely amazes me that we don't get wiped out by just, let's say we're in the caveman days and we're sitting around inhaling smoke all day and whatever weeds we can find out there and the dampness and the fungi. And you know, man hasn't really changed that much since caveman days from skeletal evidence and so on. You go back 40, 50,000 years, yeah, there's been some change. But the durability of this weak little jelly is just incredible. I mean, it boggles my mind. A lot of important problems, but that one boggles me.
What's interesting as a conclusion so far that I've drawn from what you've said is that our whole risk of dying or getting hurt or hurting other people from these energy fields are totally man-made.
Yeah,
in other words,
man-made.
before
let me
technology started, we didn't have to worry about it.
No, there's a little addition to that. A lot of geophysicists and astronomers have extrapolated this data backwards, and you know, we've had space probes up for a few years, and they have armed space probes with ELF detectors, and they want to know what is going on out there. And they find out that most of the ELF comes from our local solar system. And they've mapped out, and there are books on this, the full spectrum of radiation ELF radiation coming from the sun, which nobody knew about before, you know. And it runs to about, God, I'm thinking, 1/10,000th of a hertz, frequency-wise, up to about 300 hertz. That's what's radiating out. And the Earth happens to be a weird cavity resonator, which resonantly absorbs around 8 hertz. It fluctuates up and down depending on how many protons and the charge on the Earth's field and so on.
That's the Schumann resonance?
Yeah, it's called the Schumann resonance, right. And you get different measurements on that one. And
So the sun is a pulsator.
yeah, it's a generator because it is a huge fusion engine in which nuclei, protons, fuse into helium, and tremendous energies are extracted. But from the proton, all the radiation comes out that I'm talking about, the ELF part. But I just want to wrap up this so you have some kind of coherent idea what the hell we're talking about. Here's this wound up in a unified field theory, by the way, which is what I gave at the physics conference in Bermuda last spring. Then this is diagrammatic. This is not what the psychic sees, but, being a scientist, I have to put in a little box and put a ribbon on it. So anyway, here, right here, is a circle, and this represents the globular form of the proton. And it's spinning. You have to stop it to see this. And if you make another circle here from this point and another circle here from this point, you get a field, a radius of a field. Now let me go through this carefully and quickly though. We have inside this structure, when you're looking at it from the top or from the side, it's a bladder, like a circular bladder or blimp with a peak at each end. But Sharon gets inside here and looks out all directions to see what, it's a wondrous thing just to get her observations. And she finds that there are magnetic monopoles in certain quadrants, like here's a magnetic monopole, which come in sets of 3 and they have a certain geometry. And then there's another 3 here and another 3 here, and there's kind of a blank spot here. And then in reverse order, there's anti-magnetic monopoles here, here, and here, and then there's a blank there. All that makes for very complex physics. Now the interesting thing to me is that we can draw an axis here, which is the space axis, and an anti-space axis. All permissible algebraically, but in real life, you got to find it. And over here is time, and anti-time, forward time and reverse time. So these magnetic monopoles that are sprinkled here, there's 10 of these and there are 10 of these, but only 9 are inside this shell, and there are 2 out here, 1 here and 1 down here. They're what are called free. These are bound in a rigid geometrical structure. So this is the electron, and I will go through this thing in serial order why it's a unified field theory. A unified field theory means that you can describe all the forces of nature from one starting point. And the starting point happens to be right here, the space axis. And there's a radiation that goes out, which is a scalar wave again, and it goes into positive gravity, and it goes this direction into negative gravity. And it's a scalar field that, goes throughout the infinity of space. But it has one function. It always holds one proton to another proton. So you can imagine an infinite web of spider webs going out from the Earth into all directions, 360 degrees, and connecting with the nearest protons, which are in the vacuum of space. The hydrogen there is about 1 per cubic centimeter. It goes to the moon, and the moon swings around in the orbit. So all the laws of motion that Newton developed, you could start developing from this one point. So that's the first law, first force of nature. Over here you have electromagnetic force, which includes photons, but photons relate to electrons, as we all know. There's a special system which Sharon has worked out. There are 136 of these particles, which are also part of this system, and they're always in motion. The electron is always under the control of a magnetic monopole, that little spinning thing I showed you. And if the electron gets a message from a photon, no matter what part of the spectrum, whether it's X-ray or radiation or light or whatever, it sends a message back here, and this little guy is like a bookie. He knows what the odds are, and he sends the right message back to know what to do with this. So when you come to, I think, question somebody asked yesterday, may have been you, William, what's the role of light therapy in healing? What's the role of electrons, you know, electrical forms of therapy, and so on? They're all part of one system. And you know, there's a guy in Germany, what's his name, who does all the light work? Fritz Popp, yeah. And he's brilliant. I know him personally. And he's looking at this stuff only from photons bouncing between electrons. I finally have explained this whole system. Now he's looking at this as part of the overall envelope. The photons by themselves do things, electrons do something, but it's because they always connect back to the central computer in the little proton. Okay, that's number 2. Number 3, this is the boundary. It's a short near field. I mean, physicists all accept that, of the nuclear weak force. It only goes out so far and then it terminates, it drops off. And that's a source of gamma radiation, X-rays, all that stuff. Over here is the boundary of the 4th force, which is the nuclear strong force. And in here is something called a Higgs vacuum, which is very important, esoteric in physics. And over here, the formation of neutrinos. Now the interesting thing, according to Sharon, we can't prove this, and when she looks out, the information coming as an ELF field from a magnetic monopole is only effective if it passes through what she calls a wall of light, which is like a refracting or reflecting body, and although it has no physical structure, just fields, and that's a whole separate problem. It has to go out at a certain angle, and the angle of exit and entrance is the information as far as this system here is concerned. So we've got a whole study, and that's why we've got to put this all in a computer, because you're looking at a situation like the 3 Marx brothers running around. I mean, it's a hell of a job to keep track of them, but they do interact. Now the bottom line, at right angles to the gravitational field, is the 5th force, which we think is a real force because it's related to the massless scalars. That's the physicist's word for it. And it goes in the forward time and it goes in the backward time. So that in a nutshell is the scheme, and you know, I could spend weeks on discussing it, but to just give you a little picture of where our work has come to. And from this, and with a good computer model that we can generate and check all the equations, which is the real purpose of the computer model, we can pretty much describe everything that we have to know at this time in human evolution. I mean, from that diagram, I can explain just about anything that puzzles us, whether it's metal bending or levitation or all sorts of things. It all comes out of that little model. But that's a good background for the experimental research we do. If we have a real problem, we can always go back to the model and test the model and see if it works. Now, how you like that for a grand slam, huh? I didn't do it. This little kid did it. Well, she's a grown lady now.
I want to see how you
Huh?
I want to see how you can present that scientifically and reference your source.
Oh, I did already. I went to an international meeting, physics meeting in Bermuda last April, sponsored by Temple University, and they had 4 Nobel laureates and 17 world-class physicists, all the top names you'd recognize. And I not only gave this paper just from a physicist's point of view, but I had Sharon there, the lady who sees all this, and she was the hit of the show. You know why? Not because she's pretty and talks well and all that, But because she's a new tool, it's like giving the scientists a new telescope looking deep into the heart of matter. And everybody hounded her for 2 days. Every Nobel laureate wanted her to solve his problems immediately, you know, like, I can name a lot of names, but no, she was the hit. Nobody fought the thing. It was amazing. Well, there was one guy who fought it, and it was an Israeli, and he was pissed off because they think they're the best in the world on psychic warfare operation, and they're afraid that I would give the secret away of how all this stuff works, and then their monopoly would go. But he was he was just a little noise, like a fly buzzing around. It wasn't a big deal. But the people accepted it. And we're really, you know, we had a lot of animated discussion, but they're creative, constructive. So
I mean, I guess they like the fact that it's all verifiable.
Well, what they like is the fact that the reason the conference was called, I mean, these are people who had worked with us, who had seen Geller, who worked with the Space Kids and so on. And, you know, they had done, like John Hastert and David Bohm, a whole bunch of people I can mention, but they had no explanation. You know, that's what's missing. And so this, for the first time, gave them concrete theoretical predictions which they could check in the laboratory. You know, that's the important thing. And that's what they really like. You know, every good physicist wants to have a theory that he can shoot down. I mean, that's the beginning, and if he can uphold it, you know, he's happy. It's very exciting stuff.
I guess you follow some of the Bohm or Aharonov experiments lately.
Oh, sure, I know him very well, both Bohm and Aharonov and so on. And I pointed out the critical flaw in their experiment, you know, the coil thing and so on, that it doesn't really differentiate between local and, you know, so-called distant effects, because they're dealing with ELF that they hadn't thought about. And it explains a lot of the contradictions that people have found in the Bohm-Aharonov experiment. But no, Bohm couldn't let go of Sharana. He followed her around like a little puppy dog. He said, you know, because he's the, you know, big quantum mechanical theoretician.
Yeah.
You know, he's a lovely guy besides. Anyway, fellas, I'm sorry to kind of take all this time and bore you with a lot of stuff, but that's
very much appreciate all of that.
Well, good. I'm glad we got together on it.
Yeah. Present that to me.
What I like to wind up with, you know, this is a lot of talk, basically, right? But I think a good computer-generated model can be projected on a video screen. Not only shows what you're looking at here, but the actual dynamics, which are, I mean, this is not a static system. And then you can generate the equations to explain the particular dynamics. And you can't get an overall, you know, equation like Stephen Hawking's, where there's omega equals 1 for the constant, the quantum constant of the universe. But at least you can see how the parts interact. That's the main thing. Anyway, maybe we'll get our discipline on solid scientific ground finally after 10,000 years of watching, you know, witch rites and ceremonials and all that stuff.